All right, we are going to go back into session, and we are going to start with curriculum RC19. Dr. De Silva.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As we know, RC19 covers kindergarten through 12th grade, professional learning, curriculum writing and revising, any type of state-mandated initiative or requirement, mileage for teachers to attend professional learning and or mileage for our staff within district, material resources that are new, and some staffing. In terms of the instructional support specialists, those individuals are primarily our interventionists, both in math and in reading. There aren't any changes there other than contractual increases. Same goes with the program coordinators. There are only two in this RC. That's the director of elementary social studies and English alongside the elementary coordinator of math, science, and gifted education. All of the department chairs sit within the school level RCs. This budget does facilitate curriculum development. You'll see an increase there in terms of what we're doing this summer and sometimes throughout the year. It also supports resources for ELL instruction, not the actual staff member. Currently, that staff member is coming out of one of the consolidated grants. Consultant services, we've maintained the same amount in that line. That allows us an opportunity to have folks come in out of district that will counsel us, support us around curriculum revisions and or sometimes new resources that we need to learn more about. Dues and memberships are staying the same. Local travel is staying the same. Mr. Rudel is in a better place to explain why the ELL resource line went up and the shift there. We do have an increase in textbooks, primarily from our 6 through 8 mathematics resource, where we have our placeholder there. And that is it for RC19, and I'm glad to take any questions.
Okay, board questions on RC19.
The one thing I will make note of, and I think it's important as the district moves forward, is that our consolidated grants, which you may remember hearing about in October, are continuously decreasing each year. A significant amount of our professional learning, I don't think it appears like we have a lot in this budget for professional learning, considering it's K-12, but that is a shift that you should anticipate changing over time, given that those grants continuously decrease, and they have in the past 5 years that I've been here.
So is that why PD is up, would you say?
Let me just go to it. Ms. Sonny, you're asking why PD is up? Yes, in part that is why it's up, and it could also be because of different, right now we are actually continuing to implement Teachers College at the middle school and hoping to add some days for social studies. One of the other pieces that, in the interest of transparency, and I know that Dr. Adley mentioned this at his meeting on Thursday evening, one of the requests that I did make was for another ELL teacher. We are continuing to see an increase in the number of children that require services through as a result of their language being one other than English. And besides it being the right thing to do, it is also federal legislation that we do support those students. It's important to know that right now we have primarily our reading teachers, those that are providing our direct reading instruction to our students who receive intervention, are the individuals implementing ELL instruction that happens at the elementary and middle. We have an individual that does that at the high school who's also right now picking up additional students at our elementary level where the caseloads of SRBI are too high, and therefore we need extra support there. It's a challenge because all 3 schools run on 3 different schedules, so sharing resources with the high school isn't always easy. We have that individual also supports professional learning. She is ESL certified. She supports the professional learning for those staff members who do implement the ESL instruction on best practices, on strategies, on any federal guidelines. She also does the testing for our students across the district.
So can we see, given this information, can we see best practice on what caseloads should look like and what they currently are? Because I hear two things there, that ELL we see rising, and so I'd like to know what the coverage is on that. And then also, if I heard you correctly, you said caseloads of SRBI are high?
Well, they're not necessarily higher, but they can it ebbs and flows, right? So when students require support, we give it to them. There could be some schools at any given time where our children are requiring more support, and if that also happens to be a school that has a number of EL students who, depending upon their L level, meaning they require more versus less, it just may be too high for them to be able to support alone. Remember, we only have 1.5 reading interventionists per school. So we do make shifts. So for example, if, actually I'll speak to Oxbridge because that happens to be one. If the caseloads are lower, let's just say at Oxbridge, we may move or shift a staff member from that school to another school for a moment in time. We make every effort not to have the person that's shifting be the same person that's providing the Tier 3 instruction, but rather the Tier 2.
Okay, so maybe if we could just see kind of some best practices on what loads should look like and maybe a little bit of historical information on what it is, knowing that it can fluctuate based on student need at any given time. Can we talk curriculum development, because you are up 20, just.
I think that's just, I have a review for next one, I'm sorry.
I had some more yellow questions, if I could add on.
Sure.
Thanks. I'd love for us to start tracking this cohort. It is, as you said, a federal requirement to serve their needs, so perhaps we could start, not necessarily for this budget as much, but take a look at, I'd love to know what the population, the rate of growth of the population, what it is today, just actually some specific demographics.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, the past 5 years, I can say that we went from 17 students in 2015, 16, somewhere around there, to, let's say, this school year, 63. Some of those students also receive special education, and so that individual will consult with the special education case manager and or provider to be sure that they're coming together around what those needs are. We're required by law to translate. We're required by law to have resources available to families. Again, besides being required by law, I want to be sure that I'm saying it's the right thing to do. And all of that is coordinated through that one staff member that has really been designated as one of her primary responsibilities, in addition to providing direct services to our high school students.
Thank you. So in addition to understanding it today, I'm asking also that it go on the agenda as an item that we're monitoring going forward. Something that we look at. Thank you.
Yeah, let's think about ways to do that. But, but I hear the requests, especially with growth rates jumping like that. Mrs. Ritchie.
So just to expand on that, with the growth and only one person in charge, I'm gathering the 63 are throughout all levels,
Yes.
elementary, middle, and high school. So how is that going in terms of coordination and monitoring?
So that individual does provide direct services to our high school students, and is currently picking up students at our elementary level, given, again, just the numbers. She is also responsible to ensure that our principals and our teachers that provide that direct service, K-8 with the exception of her obviously, are provided with training on any types of guidelines, any types of legislation, all the resources. So she coordinates all of that K-12.
And then I guess to segue to the change that we see with the ELL instruction, I guess maybe Rich, this is something for you to answer. We see that transfer that came in, and maybe you can explain why that happened.
When the budget for the current year was put together, all the funds were put in a salary account, ELL instruction. That portion only really actually represents a stipend paid to the individual. The rest were supposed to be for supplies, materials, things like that. So we did do that adjustment out for that net differential of about $19,000 to move it into the appropriate line item within the budget. So you'll see that actually stipend level is flat from this year to the revised budget, but then you see it against the instructional operating equipment.
Thank you.
Okay, curriculum development, can you speak a little bit to the change in that budget?
Sure.
21
So,
through to-
what we have in Darien is different than perhaps it was done in the past, or some districts may still have a curriculum revision cycle. We do not have that. What we do have is what we call a responsive curriculum model. And what that does is it looks at teacher feedback, assessment data, what curriculum units have been revised, what have we learned from any types of standardized testing, what shifts do we need to make as a result of new courses, and as a result of all of those pieces, and I'm sure I'm missing one or two there, we make decisions at the start of the school year that may influence our work during the school year, but certainly influence the work in the coming summer months and this budget. And so from that, I receive then the priorities from our departments, and sometimes we make shifts if we feel as if we can't tackle them all, and there's lots of different reasons why that might be. Often so it's more at the elementary level where teachers are teaching a number of content areas and we don't want to overwhelm them with new units. But from that, we receive those requests, and so in this particular case, we have, for example, ELA units that even though the curriculum scope and sequence isn't the standards are not necessarily going to change, units of study may change. So they may want to integrate a graphic novels unit because teachers are saying that we tried it and it was great feedback and students loved it and were incredibly engaged. So the skills aren't changing, but the unit is. And so therefore they'll make revisions over the course of the year and or during the summer months.
Mrs. McKenna.
Can we expand on that, given that we're in the budget cycle? I'm happy that I think it's fantastic. I love to hear that we're being flexible and responsive. That's exciting. But can you talk a little bit about how that gets modeled financially? What does that look like in terms of the numbers we see in the budget?
So when I say that it's responsive, it's not responsive. Well, it could be responsive within the school year, but most of the time those decisions are made really for us as a department somewhere in that month of September.
Right.
When we're looking at the work that was done in the summer and throughout the past school year, we make decisions about what our goals are for the following year. Some of it happens in the summer months, some of it does not. And the reason that is because in Darien, we have our teachers joining our leaders to write curriculum. So we don't write curriculum in isolation. There's not an office upstairs where everybody's sitting by themselves. So instead, we have our teachers as a part of that process, which is incredibly powerful, but also means that they're not always available in the summer months. So sometimes that means that they're working after school. Sometimes we may give them a task that we need completed and they process it with their team, and they're paid stipend curriculum pay for that work, but that's how that's done.
Okay.
And so we have a pretty tight structure in terms of identifying which units across which content areas K-12 have been revised, when were those revised, when do they need to be revisited, and then which units have not been revised that continue to need work, and that's part of that process.
So from a financial perspective, Susie, to make the staffing and the dollars assigned in terms of materials to make a responsive curriculum model work, responsive curricular development model work.
Ask that question one more time, Jay.
So to set up that model, we've got staffing dollars and we have curricular development dollars. It's still that line item, for example, for it's called which one is it? Sorry. Well, professional development, for example, or textbooks, whatever. What materials and development, what staffing?
So all of those things line up. So yes, so
Right.
if there is a new, for example, if there is a new resource, so right now we're getting ready to implement 6 through 8 new mathematics, right? So even though the actual curriculum isn't changing, the primary resource is, which would require then a team to come together to revise perhaps the scope and sequence. And there may be some additions or tweaks that need to happen in a particular unit. So that's the curriculum part of it. Then there's the textbook part of it. In this case, it's a digital textbook primarily, and then we do have the hard copy. And then the third piece of that is the professional learning. And that comes from the staff developers that we allocate from the primary resource. So all of those things combined is what creates this holistic budget.
So,
Although sometimes there aren't necessarily a textbook. Sorry about that, Ms. Achman. Sometimes there isn't a textbook, and yet we still have to make revisions in our curriculum.
So given all that coordination, given some of the comments earlier about we've changed so much over the past 5 years, and I would agree, we have for the better, is the planned curriculum development for the next school year, which includes English, mathematics, science, world language, all K through 12?
Yeah, so if I were to look at what our curriculum chairs have identified as priorities, yes. And then at times there are shifts that we have to make. So for example, I would say that health and wellness has been the most challenging content, at least that I've had to be a part of, the most rewarding for sure, but the most challenging. So our 9th through 12, currently now across 9 through 12 has 13 units of study. They are implementing those units of study for the first time. We have an outside consultant that helps us write that content because we don't all have the necessary specialty to design that content. Having said that, that took longer, and we're collecting feedback on that. So now we'll make some revisions to those units after, actually we're doing that as we go now, but then we'll make additional revisions come summer and or springtime so that we can be in a better place for next school year. That work won't necessarily be done. We'll naturally be making additional revisions. But I will say that the work K-8 has been a little bit more challenging because we do not have, or K-5, we do not have a health teacher. So our teachers are teaching it. And quite frankly, we had to manage that with instructional minutes and other content areas that are being taught. So when we're creating units, quote unquote, we're thinking about how much time they're taking, we're collecting feedback from our teachers. Again, it's far more complex, and we have a consultant working alongside of us. But you'll see that multiple years coming onto RC19 because just the work is not done.
So my question was more around, is it realistic to think that in this budget year, all these areas are going to have curricular changes? I mean, this is pretty much the entire curriculum.
And I would say that yes, because some of them aren't that significant. Some are, you know, if I look at my document, for example, I might see that curriculum development in social studies 6 through 12 is more significant. We have $18,000 worth of work there, whereas in elementary science we have $9,000, a little bit over $9,000 worth of work there. So it just depends on, and some of it's small shifts, and some of it is just deeper.
Okay, Mrs. McCown.
So again, building on the same question. So when you first came, you hit the ground running very fast. And there was a lot of work to be done. And now I would think we're starting to transition to more of this regular update and responsiveness and less to this sort of intensive overhaul that we started with. From a specifically financial modeling perspective, what does that look like? Is this kind of our stasis? Is this what you sort of feel like our responsive curriculum model looks like over time? Are we kind of done with heavy investment in builds, is my question? So
the answer to that is yes and no, is that I don't ever think you'll be done. I think you'll always be investing in curriculum revisions. And the reason that is, and it wouldn't be different in that traditional 5-year cycle, you'd always be investing in curriculum. It just wouldn't necessarily be responsive to the needs of our staff or our children. This model, I would say, and yes, we hit the ground running. We hit the ground running at that time primarily with the elementary. I think that's where we saw the most significant differences. We didn't necessarily have memorialized curriculum, but I would say that that's where the most significant difference happened. We also had, around that same time, 2015, I think November of that year, we had the Next Generation Science Standards that were adopted by the state. We had the new social studies framework. So alongside curriculum revision, you're not writing every single unit at one time. It requires a lot of time. And so when people see this, they might think like, oh my gosh, aren't you done? How long does it take to write K-5 social studies units? It takes a long time because not only are you writing them in collaboration with teachers, then you're implementing them, then you're getting feedback, and this worked, this didn't work, this was too fast, this was too slow. So that change process is continual. This number, I think, if any number will stay consistent in the budget, I think this is likely the one around that amount. What I think that this district will need to realize is around professional development and instructional support staff, you should anticipate shifts up, because when your grant money goes away, that's $120 $50,000 or $175,000 that you're going to have to figure out if you still value that work, and I certainly believe you do, it's going to need to find its way in this binder.
Thank you.
Other board questions? Mrs. Ritchie?
Just on the math textbook, the $170,000, it says it's a 6-year subscription. Is that an annual cost, or is that the cost for the full 6 years?
So that's a great question, Ms. Ritchie. It is the cost for 6 years. And let me explain the challenge with this, is that I think 6 years is a very long time to purchase anything. Having said that, when you purchase 3 years, let's just say, the cost differential is very little. And so while I would hope that this district, in my absence, would be coming back in 3 years to revisit whether or not that primary resource is still the best primary resource for our children, the cost difference allows us some leeway if there's when I say cost difference, it's like a $10,000 or $12,000 difference to add those 3 extra years. And so what it does allow you to do in 3 years, like we did with math and focus at the elementary and big ideas at the middle school, it allows us to be in a process that may take another year or year and a half, and at least we still have a subscription. And so I think my recommendation at this point would be to take the 6 years rather than the 3. Because of that small cost difference, and it allows you time to study a new program if you choose to do so.
Thank you.
I know it sounds funny because it's in here and it's not a change, but can you talk a little bit about the itinerant staff travel, the local travel one?
Marge could probably speak to it more, but what I receive are timesheets. So if there is a staff member that's music staff member that's going from Royal, let's say, to Tokenique to Ox Ridge in the same day, they would be paid from going from school to school. In addition to that, when we send staff out, for example, to Teachers College or to a conference in Hartford, if they're asking to go because it's something very personal to them, but rather something that we're expecting them to go to, we pay for their mileage.
Okay. Marge, can you talk about the interdistrict?
So the interdistrict is by contract. They get the IRS rate. They submit timesheets for travel during the course of the day.
So just to follow up on that, we haven't seen anything year to date, so is there a seasonality to that, or why is it?
Sometimes they wait to submit their timesheets because it's not a lot at one time, so rather than pay them $7.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So kind of submit it all at once.
And the current ELL staff that's in the grant, which grant is that?
Title I, the consolidated federal grant.
And the supplies for that, can that go into Title I or no? Can that go into that grant?
We don't have any extra money, Ms. Sockman, in that grant. We are pretty tight. So in part of the expense, the translation services are incredibly expensive. So, for example, if we have a translator come to a PPT or translate a document or whatever the parent needs, those documents in and of itself, those are probably where we spend the most money, quite frankly, because most of the time we have folks in district that can help with some of the other pieces, but it can get quite expensive. And some of the documents that are staple documents are fine, but if they're individualized, it just becomes a little bit more challenging to cover that cost. And I think from what you've probably read in the local papers is that the increase of our students who have the strength that they speak another language other than English is characterized, I would say many of our communities are seeing that increase.
Any other questions? Okay. Any public comment on RC 19?
I have two comments. One is on the math textbooks, where it's a 6-year subscription for $170,000. I might suggest that the Board of Ed and the administration have some discussion with the Board of Finance to see if that isn't really a prepaid expense and put out onto the balance sheet, and then have the approximate $30,000 come in each of the next 6 years. They do that at times on the town side. I see no reason why that shouldn't be done on the Board of Ed side. That obviously would reduce the budget by approximately $140,000. The other question I have is on the grants on the Technology Foundation. That my glasses are over there, but it's about 77 and 74 and 74. Is that new money, or is that a previous grant that's still hanging around? And if it was still hanging around, what was its original purpose, and can it be used for something else that's in this budget of a technology nature? Thank you.
I got it. Yeah.
Hi, Robin Nelson, 51 Arrowhead Way. I realize that it is a very difficult budget year this year, but I wanted to revisit the ongoing discussion that the Board of Ed has had with the district about increasing the number of foreign languages that are offered at the middle school level, particularly Mandarin. Given the geopolitical climate, et cetera, the relevancy of that language, and the fact that when you compare New Canaan and Westport both offer this at the middle school level, I would request that the district actively look into this or continue to have this as a goal for the next 2 or 3 years to try to implement this for our students, because I think it's increasingly relevant, and it's something that we should not put off the table or put off years down the road given the budget circumstances. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clara Sartori, 161 Old Kings Highway South. 2 questions. One, is there any part of the English language learners program that is outsourced? I think at one time a lot of it was, and I just wondered if that might still be the case, that a portion of it might be outsourced. The other, I was also struck by the local travel increase in expenses. A few years ago it was $870. I see that $10,000 is requested for the year ahead, and as Mrs. Ritchie pointed out, there's no year-to-date expense listed. So I would just be interested in more detail about that. Are there more itinerant people, more itinerant programs? You know, is it really necessary to put in $10,000? Thank you.
Hello again. Karina Sartori. Just regarding the ELL, what I understand is that our numbers of enrollment are projected are declining slightly, right? But our student mix is changing, and we're getting more and more people from abroad that have multiple languages and are super qualified. So I wonder if we are taking into consideration what the impact will be in the next 5 years of that mix, and that right now we need $24,000, but that we might need more in the future for this student mix population change. So just bringing it up. Thank you.
Dr. DeSilva, I'm just going to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Because we have found the work with Margie Gillis at ELT to be very effective, and I'm so happy to see that we are asking to continue that relationship. I wanted to also, at this point, ask if we would also consider utilizing a professional like Margie Gillis, who has that state expertise in early identification of reading disabilities at the elementary level.
Dr. DeSilva, sorry, I just wanted to go back to account 52004. It looks like we're picking up field trips for certain students. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Sure. Historically, we pay for, first off, let me just thank the PTOs for their continued support of our elementary field trips. We're incredibly gracious and grateful. Besides what our PTOs pay, we primarily do pay for the gifted program field trips for any child who attends those particular field trips. We pay for that at the district level. We also pay for buses for our grade 3 students to attend the Darien Historical Society. And right now, we are paying for buses for grade 2 to attend the police department in the library during one of their units of study on community.
So, because Mrs. McNamara is not here, but in her spirit, because I can appreciate her as a colleague, I'm curious throughout the budget, and it doesn't need to be answered now. We have experiential opportunities for Fitch. We have experiential field trips for gifted. We have grade 3, grade 2. Yeah, that's SCI. Like, I'm just trying to figure out the how and the where. I can wrap my head around Fitch the best in terms of meeting students' educational needs. And IDEA might actually also fall into that group in terms of meeting certain needs of students. As we go through this, other than maybe the answer is traditional, but if we can have some thought process about how and why and who and where.
We can do that at a later time. I can speak to a little part of it. The why is currently our students in the elementary program do attend 2 field trips, with the exception of grade 2 and grade 3, that actually take 3. So that's why those buses are paid for those 2 grade levels for that extra trip. The others have been, again, graciously supported by the PTOs. All of our field trips are aligned to our units of study in our curriculum, and while we hope that they're fun too, they are connected to content and gives our children an experience that connects, that's real life, that connects to their current unit of study. I won't speak outside of the elementary program, but that's historically how we've tried to, and 5 years ago we had ebbs and flows. We had some schools with 5 field trips, some schools with no field trips, some grades with some grades with none, and we've really tried to tighten that up a bit. We receive feedback from our teachers every single spring on the field trips, and we make determinations at that point as to whether or not we're going to continue on those same trips or change them. At times, some of our grade levels do ask to attend a different trip other than the one that we have, or would like to, maybe in addition to, and this line item has paid for that, because oftentimes when they go on this extra trip or in lieu of another trip, we may make a decision that the following year we're going to have that trip instead of this one. So it helps us make those decisions. Our teachers give us feedback. Our PTOs give us feedback. And what we found is sometimes, depending upon a docent, for example, or a guide that's at a particular trip, the experience can feel different. Some schools will say, oh my gosh, this was the best trip ever, and some schools will say it wasn't. It could have rained that day. There's lots of different variables, but most of the time we can get a common thread and make some decisions about the following year.
Yeah, I think I'm just most interested in why we're selecting certain groups of students, and not for now, but maybe we can figure out the whys around that.
Can I ask a piggyback question on that? For the high school, for the field trips, because it isn't a whole grade, it's classes will do experiences in New York City or other places. How are those paid for? If you could come back with that
Okay.
too. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Deneen.
And just maybe a question more for Rich. How is that generosity tracked, those costs that are paid for by the PTO organizations?
So a lot of times they're deposited in student activity accounts and tracked on school cash online.
Any other questions? And we already called for public comment. I'll give you a last chance since I went back in. Anybody? All right. Thank you, Dr. DeSilva. We will move on to summer school RC 23.
So we had another successful year of summer school. Caitlin Sand and Mark Powers continue to revise programs, which you can see that there's a little bit of a revenue bump up, and I think the only other major thing is the adult education.
So the budget's largely flat year over year. There's two changes. One, we referenced at a finance committee earlier in the year, which is a shift of $3,000 between teaching supplies and consulting services. We did indicate that that would be reflected in the budget here. And then the cost of the adult ed program, which is contracted with the Stanford Public Schools, is closer to about $20,000. You'll actually see the previous year was just shy of 19, so there will be a gap for this year. So you'll see that increase of about $8,000. The revenue was built by looking at the enrollment of the previous summer school program and carrying that forward for this year.
Mrs. McCammon.
I have a comment first, just that adult education contracted services. I think there was a question earlier about whether we outsource anything, and we do outsource ESF or ELL for adults.
For
right?
adult ed.
Yeah. Thank you. Question about summer school. What do we do if we have families who are unable to pay summer school tuition but would like to attend?
So we do have a mechanism where Patty Renda works with Caitlin Stanton and actually Vicki Festo, and there are guidelines that we do offer some support.
Okay, how do we fund that support?
So that I don't know.
So it's largely offset by just the revenue growth that you get. So there is no separate fund for free and reduced lunch, for example.
Okay.
It just kind of gets aggregated into the total pot.
Thank you.
Looking at that increase of the adult education contracted services, at the $20,000, is it still financially more efficient to outsource than to supply our own classes?
It is.
Okay. And will the increase, I guess we're expecting an increased revenue of about $5,000?
Correct. So based on what the enrollment was this past summer, that's what we're anticipating. So part of the revenue gets split between fiscal years based on the timing of the program.
Could you, Rich, maybe going forward, I think there's kind of a theme that goes through here in terms of trends. I think even on the explanation sheet, it'd be good to see the trend of the enrollment in summer school. Thank you.
I'm guessing, I'm sorry, Dennis, sorry, you're
Sorry, I'm
right
just,
behind that.
I may be half asleep now or tired from lunch, but can you just, I don't understand 1,311 and 1,312, how we're at $2,000 and $8,000 and we're projected to go down to 506,000.
I actually think the line items might be shifted up. They should probably be shifted down, one line item. So the 2,000 would relate to office supplies, and then the 8,000 to summer school teaching.
Okay, thank you.
You'll give us a new sheet on that, Rich? Given that summer school is usually self-sustaining, is there a reason we wouldn't increase prices to help cover some of the differential? Some more of the differential?
So they, Caitlin and Mark and Rich and I look at the way the pricing goes, and we have raised, as we mentioned last year, some of the credit recovery courses. We raised the price so that we could get better teachers. Caitlin and Mark are also still cleaning up some of the old deals that had been made of fee splitting, so hopefully that will also generate more revenue. If you look through the catalog, it's hard to go much higher for some of the courses, but we will certainly ask them to take another look.
Okay. Mrs. McCammon.
Thank you. This is more for future budgetary conversations, but I'm thinking about, I asked the question earlier, how much of EOP paying tuition covers the cost of EOP. And the way that EOP is structured, you can't really see it, but the way summer school, which is actually sort of comparable, you can see the cost of running summer school versus the cost of servicing kids. I just ask that we think about optimally tracking so that we can really see what our true revenues are, so we can see what we're covering. I think I'm mixing my words up, but is my question clear, Rich? Thank you.
You're looking at covering the cost of contracted summer school services versus
No, I'm saying that when we actually have a line item in special education for ESY, whereas we have a revenue line item here. So you can see how much money you're getting from your tuition payments and whether or not you're really covering the cost of children, whether or not the tuition that children pay really covers their actual enrollment. Whereas with ELP, because all of the costs are mixed, you can't separate that out. So I'm asking whether or not we can look at being able to separate that so we can look at our tuition optimally.
I might suggest that just sort of moving forward.
Not today.
No, not just a separate. I'm sorry, it's a different sort of point. Moving forward, I'd like to sort of look at all the sort of revenue generating scenarios, ELP, summer school. Dare I say pay for participation? Dare I say that? But at least to have those discussions up front so that we know in here we're not discussing what. Sorry about that. We're not.
I was having a moment.
But the idea of like field trips and so who pays for what, I'd like to have those revenue things like resolved before we go into the budget process, so that the time is spent on other things other than we've agreed. We may not all agree, but at least we move forward with what is approved. But
I'm sorry, this year or
no. No,
Yeah.
no, that's what I'm saying. But
You're good.
No. Did I waken you up somewhere?
Any questions on summer school? And we'll get our annual update on kind of where they are when they're going out. All right, any public comment on summer school?
Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street. Sorry I didn't say that the last time. Because summer school is a unique animal on the Board of Ed, because most of the revenue is in one year and most of the expenses are in the next, it would be nice to have the actual accounting for a full year as one of the, call it appendix to this RC. So that would answer some of the questions. In addition, I think part of what can be there is not just the revenue line, but if there are certain accommodations made for whether or not it's special ed or other students, to have that there enlisted, because I think that would give a better picture of where you're standing and covering costs, only because of the split of the timing of what your budget is.
Any other public comment on summer school? Thank you, everybody, very much. We will move on to RC24, special education.
Good afternoon. Is this on? The proposed budget that you have in front of you is based on actual and projected expenditures in the current year. However, we also included the actual expenditures in the prior year in our narrative for your consideration. Leading off with substitute teachers, always a favorite conversation. Just to say also that we did in our narrative explain that the increase also reflects a reclassification for general education teachers attending PPTs. So it has been classified under account 21302. In the homebound tutorial line, account 21304, we again identified the evaluations that are completed. That account also includes extended day school instruction and also hospital settings. When students are in hospital placements, we provide tutoring in collaboration with the hospital settings or outside settings in that fund as well. Extended school year and summer PPTs. That also, and we explained in it, also reflects the number of days we have at the end of the year. So for instance, this year, the number of days we'll have in June will be 2 days and then 1 day for setup, 3 days. That's included in that increase, as well as pedagogical professional certified staff increases as well, which is a 2% salary increase. Consultant services in account 12001. We've also explained in that those consultant services really support some of our most intensive student programs, our DLC programs, our ALC programs, Excel and AIM. We continue to be able to have programs in district to support students that we use consulting service providers for. For contracted speech, we've also Again, that also reflects our most intensive learners as well. We, in our narrative, explain that we have SLPs who come in for feeding and swallowing, for prompt therapy, for different therapies that our own staff at the current time are not trained in necessarily. And at the same time, we do provide consulting services to train them simultaneously. For contracted OT and PT as well, we continue, those are based on PPT recommendations, number of students, and when there's an increased need for students, PPTs determine the frequency and duration of those related services. Legal services reflects what our current trend is for this year and what we've looked at in terms of our encumbrances. General teaching supplies is the same, so I just included that by error, but it is the same from year to year. In our PD, we are requesting additional support for the Board of Education, and we've actually listed in the narrative the areas that we really are targeting. Two things happened within that budget this year. In response to the additional staffing for our school psychologists, we added DBT training for them, so all the new psychologists began year 1 of their training, whereas our school psychologists had already been receiving on the secondary level year 2, so we're planning on that for next year. They'll go into year 2 of their training, as well as continuation of all our pre-K through 12 psychologists with DBT to support students. Pupil evaluations in the account 25001. We also explained that those evaluations that occur, there was a high increase actually in evaluations. Outside, we do contract with for psychiatric evaluations with providers within the Fairfield area as well, and that continues to be a need in order to support and assess our students within the district. Special education transportation in account 520 is actually down. In that, we actually thought we would need an additional bus. We were able to use the existing transportation we had, so we're not requesting that for next year either. And in account 52003, again, that's one fewer bus. Did I need to add anything to that, Rich? No, okay, good. In account 141001, you'll also see, again, those are our tuition public schools. The increase is really due to additional students who are attending the public programs. Again, programs that are considered public tuition programs are CES, ACES, and also it can be a neighborhood or another public school district as well that supports a transition program. In our tuition non-public, that also has gone down, as you can see. You can see there's a the trend there is also that might be attributed to, although we know it's attributed to, one, I had spoken earlier in December, students returning to district. I know see some of those students, and that would offset some of the expenditures within that account, as well as some students aging out or moving. And lastly, in the excess cost, and I know we've explained excess cost and the way that it is budgeted, we've explained in this that also the decrease in there is due to students who are aging out as well. I just wanted to add to the, when we look at excess cost and look at students who are out of district and in district, when the excess cost goes down, that also speaks to programs and students we've been able to bring back to our district, programs we've been able to design. I know I spoke about it earlier in December. We're proud to say that our DLC program on the elementary level now includes 13 students in one of our buildings. Those are students that might have had to go out. We've been able to, by using consulting services, by using contracted speech services, really maintain those students. So you might see our decrease in excess costs going down, but at the same time, our increase of students staying in district. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Board questions. Mrs. Stein.
Can you just confirm, since the tuition public is going up significantly, transportation is going down, you've taken a close look to make sure that we're not going to have, that works?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Burke.
On your legal services, I see that you have an increase of $30,000. You budgeted for this year at $260, and you estimate to $290. So is that $30,000 increase? Is that because you think that it's going to be $290 this year, and is that because of rate increases or more actual hours required for legal services, or what's that driver?
The one in the middle, Mr. Berg, it's, I really think, looking at our trend, of where we are now
It's,
in our conferences.
So it's,
I mean, in answer to the three choices of the reasons why.
okay.
In the
Pick two of them, will you? Because there's two correct answers.
All right. It really is due to what we're looking at, how we're trending. We know our legal expenses now. We know what we're looking at toward the spring as well. So I think it's an accurate estimate of where we'll be.
It is also rate increases.
And number two, it is also rate increases. Thank you for the hint, Dr. Adley. That's why he meant pick two.
Though we're still down over 2018-19 actual. Other, Mrs. McCammon.
A clarification, in the contracted speech narrative, you indicate that there's a long-term leave replacement for a district speech and language pathologist. Do you mean we have a pathologist who is on long-term leave and we've contracted someone to come in?
Yes.
Okay. That's my first question.
Mr. Brown?
I have more, but go ahead.
Just real quick, I think Mr. Rudel, the 60,000 in line 21302, could you tell us where that offset appears in the general education?
So the reclass was really effective last fiscal year, but when the budget was created for this fiscal year, it was done prior to that reclass. It was never really picked up. So we're going to be short this year in special education substitutes. So the budget that's reflected for next year is really reflecting the actual practice for this year.
It's not offset in the general, because I just, based on the narrative, that's where I was thinking it would have been seen.
No.
Okay.
Mrs. Ritchie?
So my question is about a couple of the line items, substitutes, consultants, pupil evaluation. We seem to be reverting back to the 2018-19 levels. And I guess my first question is, do we have concerns about this current fiscal year? Are we short this fiscal year because we seem to be growing in all of those areas? So is that why we're reverting back to the 2018?
So for contracted speech, we did mention at the last finance committee, we are running over. We anticipate bringing a transfer to the board for about $30,000 for contracted speech for this year. Substitutes will probably trend higher as well for this year as well.
So the other adjustments then as well, a couple, including consultants, pupil evaluation, we seem to be reverting back to year prior. So is that because we feel those, obviously we feel those line items are going up? Are we feeling that pressure during this current fiscal year, or is that something we anticipate next year as a result of incoming students or PPTs?
As we do anticipate it for this year also, and it is a result of increased enrollment and PPT recommendations.
Mrs. McCammon?
So that's specific to pupil
Evaluations.
evaluation? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. On the excess cost, to the point you were making, Shirley, about, thank you, about the fact that we've made some programmatic decisions to bring more kids in-house. As a result, we can maybe serve kids both educationally and financially more efficiently than we were able to before. Would it be possible to start modeling that, to look at, you know, we know that we've looked at Fitch and we've made a decision that it's more efficient to serve the children here rather than have them outplaced. I mean, I think as the excess cost conversation gets more complex and as we start to receive less of those dollars, whether it's driven by state or whether it's driven by our own decisions, I'd love for us to be able to see the full financial picture as well as the programmatic picture about the decisions we're making.
Yeah, I'm pondering what that would look like, but
Yeah, fair enough.
I think the model would also have to include then educational priorities, because I can imagine a situation where financially we might say it's less expensive to do it out of district, but then as a district we might decide what's our goal for children in district or out of district.
Absolutely.
And we might flip that argument. But
Absolutely.
I think if we were going to model something like that, we'd also need kind of what our educational goal is, because I imagine at some point those could compete, right? So we'd have to decide as a board what that means when they do.
Sure.
So I have a question about speech, because we pressed pretty hard on it last year when we made some reductions in speech. And it looks like it's just proved out that that's not an area to reduce. But that's an area that we will still need to support. So are you, I mean, last year, it looks like we learned some lessons. Are we comfortable then this year so that we're not running into shortfalls going forward?
And I think the idea of having multiple speech providers is really essential. So having one person, you really need multiple because they have different skills. We've got feeding and swallowing, prompt, different speech therapists. So having a one FTE won't remedy that. You really need multiple people. So I think this is an accurate reflection of where we are with our current students and needs based on IEPs. Thank you.
So you're also getting rid of an administrative assistant or a secretary?
Yes.
Speak a little bit about that.
We're confident, and which is why we recommended it to the board also. We have been fortunate to have, we have 4 secretaries within our office here. We, over the last several years, because of approval by the board, we now have a secretary in every building. We have one in every elementary school who helps support special education. We have one full-time in Middlesex and one full-time in the high school. So we're able to really kind of redirect a lot of our daily activities. Have to go POs that can go down to the elementary school, POs that can stay there. So we believe by distributing the work, we've worked with some of the efficiencies that Rich has helped us to look at as well, and we think that we can certainly be efficient and be able to work within the 3 members of our staff. We will miss the notion of that as well in terms of a staff who's left a staff member, but we're confident we can do it with the 7 people out in the field.
And is the elimination of 2 teacher aides just efficiency based on number of?
Based on IEP recommendations.
IEP recommendations.
Pupil evaluations, we've had a couple, we heard at ELP and some public comment about early identification, early intervention. Are we seeing evaluations as we would expect spread throughout the grades? Are we seeing evaluations pop in higher grades that we would have expected earlier in terms of like a desire to look? I mean, we always want to intervene as early as educationally necessary and appropriate, but are you feeling with the identification, the testing, you're seeing it bubble up in any one particular area, or you think it's pretty healthy in what you would expect out of any student population?
It's been stable, I think. You know, SRBI is one of the resources we have. Also, our students in elementary spend time, have SRBI, and very often that might, if they don't meet their goals, trigger a referral to special education. I think you'll always see a trend of more students referred in early childhood than you will in secondary. But yes, it is true that very often there will be, we had many secondary high school referrals in the last year, something you don't typically see for many reasons, but often that might also be associated with social emotional needs as well. So I do think the trend is stable of what we've seen, but we do see more referrals on elementary, less on the secondary, and the needs change when we get to secondary referrals.
Can I ask that we build a little on that question to understand? It looks like, from what you're saying, that we have seen an increase in this line item, but now we've sort of hit where you think we're going to stay. To that end, so it's spread evenly, but is there something you think that's driving that increase? Is it just all parents are we asking for more of them as parents, or are there specific areas where we're finding that we tend to have a lot of IEEs, or is there a driver behind this number getting to where it is?
I think if you look at the outcomes, so our classification rate has increased substantially when you're looking from last year to next year. I mean, CDAC hasn't reported it yet, but we know it has gone significantly from 17-18 to 18-19, and we reported that out. So I think that means that the referrals that are coming in are appropriate referrals, because if they're meeting the criteria of children who require specialized instruction, they are. So I think there is a higher incidence of classification. That's consistent with Connecticut State. You know, if you look at all of the neighboring districts, they're seeing an increase. I think IEEs are a piece to why there are more referrals, but I'd like to, and with confidence, say that we're very vigilant about making referrals also. We're making sure that our teachers are trained on doing that on the elementary level, that parents know that we are a resource for that, and that when we see that children are not responding to interventions, we do move to PPT1, and yes, we are the ones who are initiating referrals and evaluations.
Okay, thank you.
I think the big picture for special education with about just over 84 students, additional 84 students. It's managed very well. Excess cost aside, right? But that's an outcome of it. But so you're servicing a lot more students, and an efficient way.
I mean, I would just also add, I think on excess cost, for all those who are listening, the board has been signaling this and signaled it would occur this year, and it occurred this year. So I do think it sounds as if our tracking is going very well, our servicing students. I think many parents like to have their students in district, so it sounds as if parents are confident in the district and the work you're doing. But while it feels of great import in this budget, we have been saying this was going to happen and we are experiencing it. So it really is how we forecasted it, and it will be an important conversation for the board because excess cost is always that unpredictable factor. But we knew this was happening, it's happening. I think, I just reiterate, Dr. Adley and I and many superintendents and board chairs continue to implore our legislators to really look at special education funding and kind of the guesswork it does for boards of education and the stress it kind of puts on really professional departments in special education and the effects on it.
As a newbie, can I just ask a question in terms of your confidence in excess costs this year relative to the other years seems much higher? Is that a good judge or a good, conclusion that I'm making?
Well, I'll let the admin answer too, but I will say we have someone dedicated to tracking excess costs, and they're very good at it. And given that 2 years ago they started to tell us this is what's going to happen and what's going to, I as an individual board member feel very comfortable, but I'll let the administration and then any other board member can.
I would say yes, we're confident. And Heather Shea has actually developed systems that we have in tracking it, and it does do a crosswalk with IP Direct, so we're confident that our systems are efficient and accurate.
It seems like growing confidence each and every year.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Maroney, hidden in the
Yes,
back.
and then with that, so I guess I have two questions. One is, are we confident in our 75%? Because I seem to remember last year we debated 72, 74, and we're going back and forth on that number all the time.
It typically does go between 72 and 75%. The other unknown variable is what the threshold's going to be. So we did build in a 3.5% increase in the threshold. The threshold ends up being a little lower than that 75%. If it's 74, could end up working out. So the two really unknown variables are what are the threshold's going to be and what's the entitlement cap going to be. So at 75%, I think we're fairly confident. If it were to tick down to, let's say, 74%, it's not going to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of swing.
But part of the discussion last year, 75% is really the highest we've gone in a long time, and there were a few of us who were a little wary of the 75%, and I imagine that'll engender conversation this year, again, amongst board members, because 75% was high.
Right, so that's my second follow-up question. So how confident are we in that number? So we're comfortable in that we have a threshold and a return that we're comfortable with putting that number out there?
We certainly wouldn't want to go above 75%. Usually it's that 73.5 is typically where it's gone in the last couple of years, but I think 75 is acceptable.
Okay. And then my last question goes back to this foresight to the future. So do we see a trend of more people aging out? Do we see that steadying out over the next number of years? What is our forecast for the next few years?
We actually, it's not a trend. We actually look at our students who enrolled. We actually, we run a list every year of what grades they're on. We do it for many reasons. One, for articulation of staffing from elementary to middle to high school, to look at the staffing needs, but also to look at which students are aging out and aging in. So we do it from ELP coming in, and we do it from the high school aging out or different benchmarks.
I think the important variable is oftentimes you could have a student who all of a sudden, with no predictability on anyone's part, all of a sudden has needs in, November, January, or May, right? And that's sometimes where people ask, well, why'd your numbers change? What we hear from the administration is we had a new student. This year we have 84 new students to special education. So any one of them could have needs that sometimes cross the threshold. Mrs. Ritchie?
For Rich, just looking at the current fiscal year, we have our budget and our revised budget, which are the same, and then you have the estimated. Could you just speak to that number and what that number? Yes, the excess cost, right.
So we are anticipating getting about $170,000 less in the current fiscal year than what was budgeted. This December 1st filing has already gone forward. The first reimbursement will be made at the end of February, so we'll know better where we stand there. But we are very confident we won't get the $2.8 million that was budgeted.
Thank you.
That's about 75%.
Yeah, that was the discussion last year.
Yeah, Mr. Brown.
Another question for Rich, just following up. In terms of the budgeting process, I know we have a modified zero-based budget. Maybe you could talk to that process, what the modified means. Because I'm just looking at some of the RCs, the past three we've gone to, especially on the operating side, we have year-over-year unchanged in somewhere around 40% of the line items. I'm just wondering how you get there in a zero-based environment. Maybe you could speak to that modified piece that answers it.
Yep. So the majority of the items are zeroed out. The reason we could call it modified, so things like office supplies, we don't ask the RCs to tell us, let's say, how many pens or pencils they're going to buy in a given year. So things like office supplies, some of those material items, you'll typically see flat unless it's at the elementary school, where it's the allocation of resources formula. Everything else we do ask for a line item detail.
So the modified doesn't apply to the operating generally, or
some of the operating, yes, some of the operating, no. Depends on the category.
Any other questions on special ed? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Public comment.
Book is so big, it's falling apart on me. I ask this every year, so why should this year be different? And by the way, Teresa votes still at 22 Circle Road. If you could give us a breakdown by each grade of the outplaced students, I consider them Darien students. I consider them part of our enrollment, even though they're not physically in our buildings. And I would love to see that number in our enrollment numbers, or at the very least in here.
Jack Davis, 197 White Street. With the conversation, because we did anticipate from the board's discussion, but there's two other things that I was hoping would be said but wasn't. When we have a student return where we're paying the tuition, we now have to support that student with occupational therapist, speech, and other things, and those expenses were not in our budget before because we were paying tuition. Usually the number that they use is about 60%. So if we were paying $100,000, there's about 60,000 more expenses now that they're back in district. In addition, some of the children that returned were private placed, paying paid, and so now that they're back in the district, those are also expenses. So I think that while we're seeing the amounts equal in dollar amounts, the fact that we have more students, the actual cost per student is under the threshold, and I had hoped that that would have also been mentioned.
Hi. I was wondering if you would consider, I know last year during this time, the district prepared two really helpful charts regarding excess costs, the history of, as well as a chart on outplacement out of district placements as well as unilateral placements. And I'm hoping that you'd consider updating those charts because I think it really provides a very clear overview of those costs. Thanks.
Hi, Tricia Bresnahan, 11 Glenvale Avenue. I was wondering for the homebound tutorial 21304, if that's all children with IEPs, and for the OTs, since that's all contracted, it doesn't say how many OTs. I'm assuming that's why it doesn't say how many. But wondering if we have enough to cover, because historically there's a lot of absences or missed sessions, and sometimes those can't even be made up by the end of the year. So wondering if we have enough OTs to cover, because a lot of parents have said that they are allowed to miss sessions. That's it. Thanks.
Hi again, Jamie Zanik, 15 Holmes Court. Could you provide some more information about how the new elementary psychologists were categorized in the budget? I see that there's one at each elementary school except for Tokenique, which is 0.35, I believe, and then some under special education. So it'd be great to have a breakdown of how that was decided.
Any other public comment on special ed? Thank you very much, everyone. We'll move forward to health, RC 17.
I'll be presenting for Alicia Casucci today. I just wanted to say our thoughts are with her. There was a family emergency and she's not able to be here. So I hope I can answer your questions. I do want to speak for a second on behalf of her. Alicia's been wonderful to work with and has been really helpful in moving our entire district, pre-K through 12, in many ways within nursing services. I think I did speak with her, so hopefully I can answer your questions, and if not, I certainly will ask and provide anything to the superintendent that I can't answer today.
The budget is down 3%, so.
Right, so. So what am I, RC 17?
But did I see a hint, Ms. McKeown? Did you?
No, I said check.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I think we're comfortable. I think the only thing last year we heard sometimes she had trouble with nurses on overnight trips.
Right.
Any indication whether she feels like that problem is solved?
No, with the board's approval, it was solved. We were able to do that successfully this year. We had the right staffing and the right support, and we've been able to do that both on field trips and in district busing when we do need to have a nurse accompany students. She's been able to do that successfully also.
Okay, great. Any other board questions? And any public comment on health? Seeing none, we wish Alicia well and send her our best, please. All right, is everyone okay if we skip a 10-minute break? We've had a lot of breaks. We will move on to physical education and athletics. Wow, we're ahead of schedule. RC 11.
Thank you, Mrs. Auckland. Chris Manfredoni, athletic
Hi,
director
Mr.
here in high school.
Manfredonia. Here we go.
Here we go. So I'll start with what the requests are out of this budget, then I'll talk about what was cut out of the budget, if that's okay, and then I'll be happy to take other questions. So based on philosophies of keeping as many freshmen as possible, having appropriate ratios for various sports, this athletic budget includes additional coaches in the following areas: boys swimming, an assistant cheer coach both the fall and the winter seasons, as well as an assistant boys freshman soccer coach. In addition, due to some budget restraints, Superintendent and I discussed and have taken out or have suspended the 3-year cycles for uniforms for the following sports, what you see in your budget book, for baseball, boys basketball, field hockey, football, boys lacrosse, girls lacrosse, rugby, skiing, boys soccer, and softball. That savings equates to almost $90,000 in addition to those eliminations. The new wrestling mat was also eliminated from the budget as well. I could talk to those in a bit also. I did leave in the 1-year cycle replacements for the following sports: girls and boys swim and dive, gymnastics, boys and girls tennis, boys and girls golf, as well as squash. Those yearly uniform replacements are still in this budget. Those are uniforms that I believe need to be replaced on a yearly basis. They're different than the team sports you see here listed as cuts. For the sports of swimming and diving and gymnastics, those uniforms are not something that would be shared or used on a yearly basis, and they're oftentimes discarded year to year, which is why I left those in. And then for the boys and girls tennis, boys and girls golf, and the squash, essentially polo shirts, those are also left in based on my recommendation for the use that they go through over the course of a season. They're not really something that can be used year to year. They're not something that holds well. And for that reason, I left those in the budget. I think that the only changes that you see from last year's RC11 budget, the additional 4 coaches, 4 coaches, and the suspension, I'll call it the suspension of the 3-year uniform replacement cycle for those following sports.
Board questions? Mrs. Stein?
So, for the uniform, suspension of the uniform replacement, is the intention to stop the cycle for this year and then pick back up next year?
That would
So everyone gets deferred a year?
correct.
Except
So,
those?
so looking at the I guess it'd be the 21-22 cycle, they would be pushed back a school year as well.
Okay.
This budget cycle, when we put this in place about 5 years ago or so, this was the heavy year. This was the year that the uniforms had to be replaced. We saw this hit 3 years ago, this big hit. Different budget constraints, obviously, so this is why this is a heavier year than most years in that.
I guess I would only
category.
like to comment a couple things. First, as a board, we made this a priority. We really wanted to have a schedule, and we were committed to it. The second concern I have in suspending this is what is to prevent parents from deciding to go out and buy these uniforms, and we create a situation of inequity where there are teams that have capacity to fundraise and others that don't. And I feel like this is a slippery slope and not a path I'm prepared to go down right now, given where we got to with this. And you know, and sorry, Dr. Hadley, you didn't live through it with us, but
I am now.
as a board, we were really committed to this for the reason of equity. And so I really fear that we're going to have parents trying to buy these uniforms, and I don't support that.
Mrs. McCann?
On the same topic, I think my question goes back to the earlier one, which is the deferral question. That we are going to be in a similar budgetary environment next year. So again, I fully appreciate looking at what we can and can't do and trying to be flexible. I just want to make sure that we don't end up having to defer in perpetuity because we're in the same budget cycle for about the duration of the contract, which is 3 years. So that's my comment.
Certainly, is it sort of?
Yeah.
Certainly, we don't think that we're not planning a scenario. It may eventually happen, but we're not planning a scenario where we're dependent on parents to pay for uniforms. We're not designing to go, okay, well, we'll just build in that people are going to come to the table, right? We're obviously saying that if we're going to defer it, we can defer it for a year. Same way as we were talking about iPads and so on and so forth, deferring those types of things. We can operate, and we don't feel that the kids will be required for their parents to go out and purchase uniforms. That's not the design of the model. But I understand. I understand. That might be the reality, but.
I guess I would also ask the question, what condition, or have you looked at these uniforms to see the condition of all these uniforms and whether they can be used another year?
Yeah, so I did. I had conversations with coaches, and for the most part, they can be used another year. I mean, not ideal, but can we sneak a fourth year out of them? We could, but it's not ideal.
And then those fourth years, so, sorry. The fourth year, then those, historically, those uniforms will go down to JV or freshman level. So will we need to then also replace freshmen and JV because we've gotten another year out of these uniforms and they can't be recycled down? I mean, so to Jill's point of deferring, are we going to incur more costs because we're then going to need?
So I think we have to be clear on two things. One, the environment isn't the contract, and I think it's been said a couple times. The environment is the cost of paying staff and healthcare, and that's ongoing. 3 years, 6 years. I mean, that's just life, right? I mean, you have to pay people and pay for health insurance. And so I think what I'm hearing the board say is that, like, deferring things we know we're going to do, we're just setting ourselves up for a mountain. And I wonder if this is it. I'm a little confused why, I mean, I understand swim and gymnastics is not something you're going to repeat use. I'm a little confused why, like, a tennis and golf shirt puts on more wear or tear than a boys lacrosse shirt or a girls field hockey shirt.
I mean,
they all stink at the end.
They do. We do recondition at the end of the season, but the tennis, the golf, again, those are polo shirts. They're just not. For the most part, the wear and tear is not there, and they're not something ideal that you want to wear year after year after year for certainly a 3-year cycle. And so we've traditionally have gotten those teams, I think rightfully so, new polo shirts every year. It's just something that they're not, the quality, it's, you know, they're not as expensive, but the quality is just not, you know, as it was with these other sports that you see here.
Yeah, so Dr. Adley, something you said earlier about like when we did these cuts, or when we were looking at the budget, we were trying not to take away from kids. And I feel like, you know, this is one of those tricky areas. I'm wondering if what we're saying is we really want to invest educationally within the athletic budget. Is this really where we need to do it? A shirt off a kid's back, literally. It worked. Usually Dennis does it, but
that's
I did
a bit of
it
an
this year.
exaggeration. I mean,
well, but I do. I think what you will see, and Mrs. Stein is correct. I think parents will go out and try to fundraise and come to us with gifts. And we already see this with the, quote, black jerseys at the high school. Every team raises for their own black jersey. And what I'm wondering, because I'm already hearing it from parents, is we're going to go buy uniforms and come to you. And I just don't know if for the $89,000, is there not somewhere else, and it doesn't necessarily have to be within athletics, but, you know, we look at things like transportation, sophomore teams, you know, I don't know. I'm not trying to take away from athletics, but I just don't know that deferring these costs really moves us forward. Mr. Seedy.
So, I mean, by doing this, you're almost saying that our original schedule was not proper. And, you know, so is the question, should we be elongating the life of these? Sorry, these are new too. Unfortunately, are we elongating life? Should we elongate the life cycle of the uniform? I mean, delaying 1 year and then going back to the same cycle does nothing over the long term. But then it goes to the question: are there other areas? So, like, you know, my questions were more of the assistant coaches and maybe helping me understand the addition of, you know, the assistant coaches within each edition.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about those?
So just to follow up on John's question, look, I don't agree with deferring $90,000. This was a ongoing conversation. It's something parents brought to the table consistently. Some of the stories were kind of horrific. These kids could even be in Darien wearing some of these uniforms. So to me, this makes no sense. And deferring just pushes it to another year. It doesn't solve the problem. To John's point, is it the right cycle or not the right cycle? But we agreed to this. I think we should stick to it. But then the follow-up is on the addition of coaches. I'd like to understand from you kind of the ratio of athletes to coaches. You look at right off the bat, you're asking for assistant cheerleading for fall, assistant cheerleading for winter.
Right.
You already got 13 cheerleaders and 4 coaches, so you're at a ratio of 3.25 athletes to a coach. I mean, that makes no sense.
If I can break that down a little bit, it's 13 per season, and so we field a team in the fall and a team for the most part in the winter, the same kids. And so the 4 coaches you see there are 2 for the fall and 2 for the winter, so the ratio really should be 13-2 and not 13-4.
That's a good point.
They're different coaches.
If historically, we the board and myself, we reduced coaches, the assistant cheer coach in the fall winter, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It was for low enrollment. We had, I think, at that time, less than 5 participants per season in that sport. Since then, we've been fortunate to have some growth in the program. We're upwards of 13 kids. And I think it warrants a second coach for nothing else to provision in a better ratio.
But you said it's 2 to 13.
Correct.
2 coaches to 13.
Correct. Yep, there's 13 participants per season. Per season.
So based on that, can we look at the stipend numbers? Because if I look at cheerleading, for example, it specifies 4 coaches, and I understand what you're saying. But the coach's stipend's only $10,000, which I understand the coach's stipend for just a base rate to be 4.5-ish. For cross-country girls, it's coming out to 14. For football, it's $67,290. For unified sports, it's $3,000 and $7,000. So it looks like there are some sports where the number of coaches doesn't line up to the stipend dollars. I don't know if there are programmatic
different categories.
Different categories in the contract.
You have to look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Coaches are paid at different levels depending on the
It's
sport.
based on the coach's stipend are leveled. It's based on the teacher's contract.
So what's the range?
You know, off the top of my head, the level 1 coaches are probably correct me if I'm wrong, central office, but I think around 8,000 or and change, and then the lowest end or assistant, probably sub-varsity coaches are about 4,500 or so, ballpark.
You can find it all in the back of the contract on the grid.
It depends on the sport and then depends on the team.
Can you talk a little bit then about what are the numbers that are pushing the need for an assistant coach? And I understand last year we had a little bit of this conversation, different sports fall into different categories, impact sports, non-impact. I remember I was corrected. But can you talk a little bit about what are the numbers or what's the increased interest in swim and cheerleading and soccer? What's driving the need for an assistant?
Yeah, so in speaking to the cheer coaches, the assistant boys swim coach, it's for increased enrollment. It's to bring them in line to what we see at the girls level. It's to bring that ratio back to, I think what we have is it's about a 1 to 12 ratio or so for coaches per student athlete. We've seen an uptick in the number of boys swim participants the last few years. They also don't cut, which I think is part of the the issue. And then for the assistant boys freshman soccer coach, again, we're committed to in that sport anyway, in sports, and is keeping as many freshmen as possible and having that second coach available to help supervise and grow a program and keep many kids. The girls soccer would also have a second coach if we saw the numbers there. Just numbers aren't there yet for that program. But we anticipate if that were to happen that we would come back with that request as well.
Mrs. Ritchie.
Just following up on that, so currently the boys swim team has a coach and one assistant coach in this current season, is that correct?
Correct. One head, one assistant swim, and then the dive coach.
And are the numbers that you're using for number of participants, are you using this year's number for next year?
So when this was developed, it was before the winter season, so it was based on last year's number. They're about the same number though for this year.
So to that point, if you look at boys swimming, are there 3 coaches and 29 athletes that we're looking at? So the ratio is 9.6 to 1?
So right now there's the head boys swim coach, the assistant boys swim coach, and the head dive coach. So remember, the diving is separate in a separate facility.
But you've got 3 coaches under boys swimming. You've got 1 coach under boys diving.
That would be for next year.
Isn't this supposed to be what we're doing now?
Well,
That's his 2021 worksheet.
So the numbers you see in that...
This includes what you're forecasting?
Correct. It does.
So,
Mrs. McKenna.
I'm going to ask my same question just to make sure that I'm clear on it. Because if I look at unified sports, 3 coaches at 7803. I don't understand that.
So again, seasonally, so we have 1 unified sports coach, happens to be the same person, 1 for the fall, winter, spring. So 3 coaches, it's divided over the course of the school year. We run it year round essentially.
So it's 1 person.
It is 1 person. It doesn't have to be 1 person. It happens to be 1 person seasonally.
If
Fall,
you
winter.
had 2 people, let's say, it would change the number then because they'd be getting a.
If we had 2 people per season, it would change the number. Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So again, just in fairness to Chris, the budget was difficult this year. You've heard this morning how we've impacted different departments in RCs the whole way through. The one thing we've tried to do is not impact the programmatic nature. We haven't played a political football with sports in the sense of, okay, let's reduce the number of practice games, let's reduce the away games, we've tried to keep the program in place. But I'm letting people go in this budget, in this office, in the schools, and across the district, and making some other significant choices from special education to academics. Chris was charged with, look, listen, you got to get about $100,000 somewhere. And this is what he came back with, and I understand, and I certainly respect board members' opinions. It comes to board discussion, but I, for one, support what he puts in place. I don't think the kids, if I thought that was compromising what the kids were going to look like or otherwise, then that would be different. I don't think that's the case, but anyway, I just say that as a frame of reference, respectfully.
Talk to me about the wrestling mat, which we've already received an email that tells me the mat is very old. Talk to me about the mat, the safety, the kids.
Yes. So
The amount of money I'm talking about.
Yep. So the wrestling mat quoted out is $9,100 for a new mat. The current mat we have is indeed old. It's at least 10, probably upwards of 15 or so. I think it was in place at the old building. It kind of puts that in perspective for you. It is safe. It's not unsafe. We're currently using it, and if I thought it was safe, we wouldn't be using it. So I respectfully disagree with that statement. But it's old. It's I think it's past its life expectancy. Again, we had a discussion about what some cuts were to be made. These are difficult decisions, but that was one of the cuts we had to make that Dr. Adley and I discussed. So, so the cliff notes are: it's old, yes. It's not unsafe. There's.
So as you go through all of your equipment needs, what made wrestling mat pop up versus soccer nets versus football? I don't know what they use. The goalposts are up. Something like what made the wrestling mat bubble up?
I just think the age of it. I just think it's something that we've got its life expectancy out of it. We've got good use out of it. It's just something that needs to be replaced at this point.
I guess I was asking the inverse. What made it pop up as an acceptable cut? If we've gotten its useful life out of it.
I guess it was a discussion that Dr. Adley had and I, and it was something that, again, not easy decisions to make when you're making cuts, but it was, when you're looking to try to cut $100,000 out of a budget, it was something that.
But it's challenging to say it's past its useful life expectancy, but it's safe. That makes no sense to me in terms of how technology changes and different things change. So
it certainly is safe, but wrestling mats, they do have a they're durable, and the one we have is good. It's a Duralite mat. That's the top of the line that was purchased X amount of years ago, but
that stuff all should be on some type of normal replacement cycle.
Just like turf.
So we don't have these conversations. And we don't talk about why we're cutting a 12, 15-year-old mat for $9,100. It's a total waste of time.
Well, Mr. Burke.
Right. I mean, I understand the notion about useful life. I think when we had the football field replacement and the run-up to that, I mean, the determination was it was technically past its useful life, but it was rated as safe and proper, and so we didn't, we pushed that out a year. So I get that concept. I'm not an expert on, wrestling mats, but I do agree with the notion that we as a board made a commitment about these uniforms after hearing about them from years to years, and we set up this cycle, and I think we have to reevaluate that potential cut.
Mr. Manfredoni, talk to me about transportation, since it's a big number in here. How much of that is non-SEAC, FSEAC transportation? Like, I want kids to be able to play and what they need, but if I have to start making cuts, I'm wondering, is there stuff in there that is non-essential?
So we do, when I developed that budget number, I look at each of our sports, each of our teams at different levels. I multiply the number of contests a team could potentially have, right? So if you look at a varsity team that could potentially go to an FCAC and state final, you multiply that by what it about is for a cost of a bus to come up with a number. So
no, I guess what I'm asking is a little bit, quite frankly, and I know this because my kids do it, so I know they can be mad at me if they were watching, but if you go on a scrimmage, right?
Yes.
And you take a bus, in
yes.
some ways it's a little bit like field trip, and we've cut those from the budget. So is the scrimmage or the non-FCAC, non-tournament required, are we asking, out of state, are we asking parents to pick that up? Or is the district picking up those buses? And if we have to find savings, could we outfit our kids, but maybe look at cost sharing in that because it's a non-required activity?
Well, I mean, so the scrimmages are certainly non-required, but they're essential, I think, in a sports season for a team to prepare. And so we do allow our teams to take a bus to an away scrimmage. Each team, depending on the sport, is allowed up to X amount of games. We max out at that number. We don't certainly limit the number of contests that's allowable, permissible by the CIAC. The district does pick up the cost of those buses in the event if a team is taking a larger longer trip, and they choose to take a coach bus, then the difference will come out of the student activity account versus what a school bus would cost, which has been an ongoing practice for many, many years here. I would be reluctant to start limiting either the non-CIAC, the non-FCIAC matches, because, and so in many sports we're given an X amount of games. Let's say you can play 20 games. The FCIAC may only support 16 of those games. Okay. For the benefit of our kids, we look to pick up those additional 4 games in whatever. I'm just using a number as an example. It's better competition for us. It allows us to strengthen our schedule. Allows us to strengthen our seed in a state standings, and so for us to not be able to go out and pick up those extra non-FCI games, I think would be detrimental to a certain athletic program. Athletic program.
Mrs. McKenna. I'd like for us to talk a little bit about fundraising, whether we decide to cut busing or uniforms, or whether the administration decides it. I think that for playgrounds, we could have a minimum playground, but we ended up fundraising, and we built gorgeous playgrounds at a lot of the different. We're fundraising for black uniforms, as you said. So I'm wondering if whatever is cut, we talk a little bit about sort of pooling resources. The PTOs do it. They have caps on how much that each student can get, making sure that all of our, whether it's a wrestling mat, whatever it is, let's go back to the parent body and say, look, we're in a situation where we're looking to cut some in athletics, and if it needs to be uniforms this year, maybe the sports teams as a group come together and fund their uniform replacement cycle this year, or something to that effect. I understand that may not be the choice of which one it is, but I just think there's a tremendous amount of fundraising that goes on for sports. We pay for all kinds of equipment, lifting things. I feel like it's getting late. Okay, that was pretty funny. But some athlete tell me what I'm talking about. Keep going. But I just feel like there's an opportunity to have the administration make a call. We need to cut about $100,000. Let's go back to the parent community. They certainly raise that much, and say, if we feel like there's a need.
Talk to me about sophomore teams.
So we don't have sophomore teams.
I know,
we do play some sophomore games.
Yeah.
In the sport of football, for example. So we have roughly 20 sophomores in the football program.
Is that the only program that has kind of just a chance for other kids to play at that level?
Yes.
Okay.
They've aged out of freshmen, so there's no more freshman games for them to compete in. They do dress and travel and sometimes compete in the JV games, which is I think a 10-game schedule. Many times those sophomores will get very minimal playing time in those JV games, and so as an opportunity for kids to get just some more game experience, we will go out and schedule with other local schools 1 or 2 or 3 sophomore-only games for those 20 or so kids. This past year, we had 1 away game at New Canaan that we competed in with the sophomore, just sophomores. So I wouldn't describe it as a sophomore team. Do we play 1 or 2 sophomore games? We do. And I think it's just an opportunity for those kids to get some game experience, because they're getting very limited during the course of the football season.
Mr. Maroney.
I have a couple of points. First off, for your athletic cost per category, one thing you were talking about cheerleading and unified sports being different seasons. I would love to see this broken out by season. So, you have track, indoor track, cross country. It's basically the same. They're basically the same sport. You're running. Track and field is different, but indoor track and outdoor track are the same, but you have them split into 2 different categories. You have dive and swim, different categories. Unified sports should be 3, so we can compare them equally. It's very difficult to look at this different in that way. Second point was to Tara's point about scrimmages. What I think would be very interesting, and a way maybe to save money, is I would love to see the work done of what scrimmages are and how do we ask parents to pay for those. But can we break that out as opposed to what you were saying, is what is mandatory to play and what is a nice to have to play, as well as who goes to these games. So With football, which is 139 players, do they all go to every game? Or does only the varsity travel to the game? Same with lacrosse. And so maybe we only take 2 buses as opposed to 3 or 4. Will that save us money? And again, I think we need to go down to this type of level to understand who's going, who's not going, who's going to pay, who's not going to pay.
Mrs. McCown.
I think I could actually formally motion for us to move on, I think. But what I would like to recommend at this point is that we say to administration, we're in favor of, we understand it's a cutting environment, we're in favor. We have some questions about the uniform replacement cycle, both because we have committed to it and because we don't want to defer costs. Would you take another look at the best place to cut $100,000, whether it's sophomore scrimmaging, whether it's uniforms, whether you talk to parents, but will you take another look at this budget and see if this is the right place to cut, and we come back to this RC next time?
Well, I think I would broaden that request even, because I can imagine the questions that are gonna come up. I think what I'd like the administration is to go back and kind of come back to us with both best practice and why they're doing what they're doing, and where they could cut, knowing that the board has signaled they're uncomfortable with uniform replacements being the cut. I think that's probably a good way to go.
I think my challenge is where does this $100,000 number come from?
Yeah.
Like, nobody said to cut athletics $100,000.
Well,
so
I think we're
I
cutting
appreciate everyone looking at ways to trim the budget, but I'd rather see what we need to continue with what we promised and what we deliver, and then have the conversations we're having. But we're getting focused on this $100,000, and I don't know where it comes from.
No, not necessarily fixated on giving. Everybody wasn't given a complete number per se, right? That's the way it played out. That's what I asked for Chris, if he can come in at that. Others come in lower than that, a bit higher than that. Others come in with suggestions. No, I'm not doing that. We're not doing that. We're not going to get rid of X, Y, and Z. So it really, that's where athletics ended up falling. Please tell me respectfully that the board is not asking me to go to the parents to fund this. You're not asking that, right?
No.
Okay, right, okay. Because that is not what the budget is built upon,
Yeah.
asking parents.
Yeah.
If I thought that we couldn't do without the jerseys and the other uniforms, that we had to go back to parents, it wouldn't be on this list. But you're asking to go back and come back with another.
So to be clear, I don't think anyone on the board is saying that what we cut, parents need to pick up. I think
Right.
the reverse is true. What the board is worried is that when you cut something like uniforms, we actually know the culture very much in this town, that
Yeah, I know.
the next meeting we'll have parents up saying, I have a gift for you to accept of new uniforms because I want my kids playing in new uniforms. And you set a replacement schedule and we want you to follow it. And we're trying to avoid that because we don't want to put that on parents. If we need to find efficiencies, and if athletics is someplace that the administration is looking to find efficiencies, we're looking for another look at the program and seeing if there is a different area for efficiency. So I would agree with Ms. McCammon, rather than us coming up with the suggestions of where to do it, we're asking you to go back and take another look if there's somewhere else that would be more efficient and keep us out of a fundraising quagmire. Mr. Sini.
And I know this question is going to be more deeper policy issue, but the participation. I mean, if you can't find and you really want to take away, and the board wants to maintain a standard, there's only one way to get there. So I mean, this is my first time bite at the apple.
Are you saying, John, increase the budget?
No.
No.
Because I'm saying.
No. Well, let me be clear.
But
I'm sorry. Create a revenue source tied to that budget. So. But again, bigger policy discussion. It's going to be very difficult to have that in light of this budget discussion.
So I think what's happened, and those of you who have sat here for the last 4 or 5 years can appreciate this, is often what's happened, it's been put on the board to kind of solve a lot of these problems, whether it be revenue, whether it be cut, no cut, whether it be what is really equity. And what we're asking the administration to do, and maybe the cuts have provided the perfect opportunity for it, we'd like you to go back and come forward to us and defend the program and or tell us where the program can be cut. And if it's only uniforms and we disagree with uniforms, we're responsible for that budget effect. But we don't want to solve the problem. We're asking you to go back and take another look.
Well, just to be clear, like, one option is to, okay, you've cut some things today, administration. We actually would like to add more in. I mean, that's a clearly, I didn't want to bring a budget forward that I didn't think, you try to get the Goldilocks effect somewhere along the way here that's going to match the town and what's going to be acceptable, and that's what we thought. But I'd be delighted for the board to put things back in again. I mean, that'd be wonderful if you thought it could fly, but
we're not done yet.
Okay, right, but we can certainly go back. I'll just say this: just you may not like my response back, though. You may not agree with that again. So, but we can do that.
I just say take a deeper look and come back to us. And I think that would include, if I'm correct, both uniforms, wrestling mat, and tell us if you feel that money needs to come out of this budget. Are these the places you really would like us to consider?
And coaches, I mean.
And adding coaches, yeah.
But is there also, and I don't know, a best practice too, having a conversation, I mean, it's a great spreadsheet you put together here. I don't necessarily understand the ratio of coaches to athletes, and then also like the conversation about class size or clubs. At what point is it really viable to have one of these teams based on the number of participants versus does it shift to a club or an intramural type sport that we figure out another way to fund or to support? I mean, it's like the conversation around clubs and size classes. We can't constantly be everything to everyone and take care of 5 or 6 people. We should where it makes sense, but those are some of the hard things that I think need to be looked at.
Mr. Brown.
Just clarification, Mr. Cini, the revenue sources you mentioned, is that something we want to hear from the administration as well?
I heard earlier we're not prepared to discuss that, but if you are, I'm more than happy to hear it.
I just think the time, the revenues just sort of looked at thoughtfully outside this process.
Perfect. Agreed.
I think what I'd like to do is keep the board out of things like cut, no cut, because we've talked about it many times and said that it's really a coaching philosophy. And if that's the case, then we need to hear from the administration about their teams, why their teams, you make a good case for scrimmages, right? That's because you know this business, you know this. So come back to us, defend your budget, tell us where you can, if you need to cut, and then the board will have to make the hard decision one way or the other. That's the quickest we've ever done athletics. Anyone ever have a question?
Really?
It was?
Yeah.
Can I just ask one other question on uniforms? The supplies, is that down, I'm assuming, because of the ice machines from last year? If I
Correct.
remember. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yeah,
supplies, you're
training
fine.
supplies?
Yeah, you
Correct.
have enough training supplies.
Correct, yes, that was,
okay, 'cause
that
that's
was
a significant decrease.
Yes,
in
the ice machine was the reason why.
Sorry, officials, I'm assuming is just contractual with the leagues.
Correct, yep.
And then cheerleading didn't show up on either in what you're saying we should replace. It is on the replacement schedule, so where do they fall?
In terms of uniforms?
In terms of uniforms, they were due for a new uniform and skirt.
They got this year. What I'm looking at, looking at it, which, I don't know what version you're looking at.
No, I don't.
No,
Well-
cheerleading got last year.
Well,
2 years ago.
17-18.
17-18. Yeah, so they're due.
Yeah. I don't have, because we don't have this one.
Okay, well, that would be.
If we could,
Cheerleading got new uniforms this year.
yeah, if we could have the schedule Dr. Adley has, which
Okay,
looks like
so
it runs
that
all the way
that would
through.
be useful.
One
That would be
Dr.
useful.
It runs all the way through 2023. Ours, the one I'm looking at, and
2021?
yeah.
Okay.
So we
Unless
Yes,
outdated.
this is also online. I'm not sure what version Dr. Adley has, but this is also.
I had the
Okay.
online version.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have the
An older version?
mine.
I have one story.
Yeah. All right, so they got theirs last year, which means that they've moved up on their replacements. Okay. Dare I ask? Public comment. Oh, Mr. Maroney.
I just really want to be clear. I think it's, and maybe this is the wrong time to say this, but I'm going to say it, is I think it's difficult to go through this budget, and it's not a lot of money to add, the stipends for these assistant coaches, but we're cutting a lot of other things, and to Duke's point, I think, and maybe I'm wrong with this, but to add a coach or assistant coach to teach 13 girls seems like a lot, and I think we really need to be confident in what we're asking for to sell this back to the taxpayers.
So I feel like what I'm hearing is that there is a belief, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just pulling from it, that you'd like no cuts at the freshman level. That's why you're.
I mean, it's not. It's for most sports, yes. It's just not feasible for all sports. There are some sports that, based on the number of kids that we had come out, we just possibly couldn't keep every.
So I think that's part of like the explanation, right?
Mhm.
The department has a theory, they'd like to keep freshmen involved, and because of that, numbers are rising, which kind of goes to Mr. Romani's point, it fits.
That's for soccer. That applies to soccer.
Well, I'm saying it looks like cheerleading. I mean, I don't know, I heard you say we'd like freshmen to have the opportunity to play, so that's where we need to know why we're adding, because we are cutting
Sure.
staff in other areas, so to add staff, even though the differential in the healthcare is very different, we just need to know why we're adding staff versus subtracting in other areas. I mean, a $3,000 stipend is very different than a full-time employee with health benefits, so we also can't compare apples to
I
oranges.
agree.
That's fair.
Just to help us defend these positions would be a little more than just, let's make it equitable amongst boys and girls swimming. I think I need a little more of why we're hiring this coach.
Any other board questions or comments? Okay. Public comment on athletics.
Jack Davis, 197 White Street. I'm a little gobsmacked on the conversation on the uniforms. The reason that I recall, having been around for a lot of years, of why we started this cycle wasn't so much that parents were buying uniforms, it's that parents were buying uniforms and deciding what those uniforms should look like, as opposed to having a brand for our school and our high school. And part of the reason Brenner took this on, which was not an easy task, was so that the administration controlled the branding of our uniforms for our sports. So discussing whether or not some parents want to come forward and spend $10,000 on the uniform, I don't have a problem with that, providing they understand that it's coming into the administration, and the administration is deciding what that uniform brand looks like, because that's why this was taken on.
Lori Olson, 16 Littlebrook Road North. I'm also the PTO chair at the high school. I was looking at page 85, the cost per category, and lacrosse has 111 students, and their bus transportation cost is $11,172. Football is 139 athletes with the same number, and baseball has 42 students, and it's $15,897. I'm not understanding how it costs more money to move 42 students than it does 111. I don't understand the transportation costs.
Number of games.
The fee, is that for entrance fees? Because we've been talking about clubs and how they pay their own entrance fees for parents. Page 84, the Student Activities Fund, 102005. Board of Ed, it looks like, doesn't contribute to that student activities account. But as Duke said earlier about field trips and the generosity of parents and tracking, we should be tracking what parents are contributing for their athlete during the school year, because that money at the end of the school year gets swept out, and we have no idea where that goes. Parents contribute on and off the books their entire athletic season, and I don't believe that this cost per athlete is accurate. Coaches, paid and unpaid, I don't believe that's an accurate number either. Every adult that interacts with our students should have a background check and be on the team rosters. We wouldn't have teachers coming into the high school volunteering and stepping in a science class without being being vetted through our schools. The revenue from football and basketball games that's collected, I don't see that anywhere in this budget. Contingent of the uniforms, Dr. Adley wasn't here 3 years ago when the basketball team was handed uniforms, and while they were running down the court, kids lost their pants, literally.
That's a problem.
Lost their pants, and I don't think that's equitable. Sophomore teams, first I'm hearing about it. I understand that it's great that the football team has a sophomore group that they feed into. But we can't say that baseball, basketball, swimming, any other sports can't get that same experience, or that those kids are worth anything less. Sorry, I've written a lot of notes. I feel like athletics comes up a lot because just like, athletics is an extension of the classroom, we wouldn't allow one science class to have a lab, tools for experiments, while another class is given a textbook and told this is how you deal. So I feel like transparency, equity has to happen for all of our students.
Beth Lane, 16 Hillcrest Avenue. I also, on this cost per category, I noticed at one point when we received this breakdown, we also had a breakdown of what parents contributed for certain sports. And if that is in here, it is extremely opaque. I can't figure it out. And I know I paid a not insubstantial fee for 2 of my kids to be in a sport this winter, and I cannot see that in the line item on that sport. Thank you.
Amy Zerby, 9 Morehouse Drive. I just wanted to give you a little more information about the cheerleaders. There are currently 14 cheerleaders, and of those 14, 13 are freshmen and sophomores, and there were 13 in the fall. In fact, we needed to order more uniforms in the fall due to an increase in demand. In addition to cheering at the games, the team is beginning to participate in cheer competitions along with almost every other team in Fairfield County. So they are practicing more on stunting and gymnastics compared to previous years. Just also, in general with fundraising, some sports have significant difficulty in fundraising, so they would not be able to purchase their uniforms.
Clara Sartori, 161 Old Kings Highway South. I think you have a really hard job, and you brought up, I appreciate that the superintendent is trying to control costs a little bit, but I was actually struck by your reduction in athletic training supplies. This year, you've already spent $9,180, and the budget for next year is $6,000. So it appears that you would have to get that money from somewhere. And I guess as I was listening to the special ed presentation and saw that you reduced 2 aides for a good reason, I just wondered, with kids moving into the district, suppose you need those 2 people back again next year because somebody has moved in. So I guess with all of these reductions, I think it's very commendable that you're doing it, but I wonder what contingency plan you might have if, for example, kids move in, you need the aides, you can't really reduce the uniforms, you can't reduce the sports tape and the ice bags. I mean, what would happen if you really needed all this money back again next year? So I hope you would consider that in your deliberations as you make an effort to make these reductions. Thank you.
Hi, Julie Best, 38 Red Rose Circle. Lori kind of touched on this briefly, excuse me, but I just wanted to go back to kind of my question earlier from the DHS budget. I'm curious if this athletics budget includes all the registration fees and costs associated with these teams participating in the competitions and events, whether they be conference or good experience or what have you. And if so, do the clubs and councils have the same budgeting going on for them? I'd love to see that. I'd love to know if that's the case. Thank you.
Teresa Vogt, 22 Circle Road. I want to go back to Mike Lynch's thing because I actually contacted one of the tennis coaches because I know her. So just to give you a quick answer to the tennis courts, so you know, the town reserves 4 courts at Weed for the girls' JV team. The boys use Cherry Lawn. It is also, they have to make sure that they don't conflict with town programs. Just so you know, that's how the tennis courts are working. But as for fundraising and uniforms with athletics, it's kind of funny we had this conversation about the uniforms back when Mr. Sadlon was here, we were talking about our students, and a very large portion of our students paying for their dresses and their tuxedos themselves, and for those boys, paying for them each and every year because they grow each and every year. So I really think if we are going to continue paying for our athletes' uniforms, we should be paying for our music students' uniforms as well. And then in terms of fundraising and inequity, the simple solution is to have a policy. a policy. If the PTOs at the elementary level have a policy to talk about equity in terms of their own fundraising, I don't think it is unfair to ask our teams to have some kind of equity in fundraising as well.
Tara, while we have Mr. Manfredonia here, should we have the conversation about the tennis courts?
Yes,
I don't
please.
believe he was here this morning.
Sure, Mr. Manfredoni, we had a question on tennis courts, because in the capital budget, it looks like we are doing a complete renovation of tennis courts. And the question was, did we need to build more tennis courts, or are is the number that we have sufficient?
So, to run a varsity tennis match, you play seven matches. On the boys' side, it's 5 singles matches and 2 doubles matches. On the girls' side, it's 4 singles matches and 3 doubles matches. The only school I know of in the FSAC that is able to put out all 7 matches at once is Wilton. Most schools, as far as I know, have 5 or 6, which means you put your 5 matches out, you wait till 1 or 2 of those matches complete, and then you put your last matches out. So in a tight contest, they can go very long. Just imagine if they're long sets, you play best of 3. There are some tennis matches that will go sometimes almost until dark. So the need to have 7 is based on the number of matches that are played at the varsity level. Can we compete with 5? We can. Is it nice to have 7? It would certainly be very nice to have 7. I think a more immediate concern right now is the condition of those courts. They don't drain well. They slope towards the back end, if you're picturing them on the wood side. So we often have standing water. We've had to fix them, I think, every year in the last 3 or 4 years at least, to deal with the cracking that takes place. And so I think it is time for those courts to be completely resurfaced. To me, that's a better way to spend the board's money than to have an additional 2 courts. I'm not saying the 2 courts wouldn't be nice, the additional 2 courts, having 7. I think when this is looked at, I think by the DAF a number of years ago, I don't know, there's a repository, a water catch area that's just next to those tennis courts, and I don't know if that would impact the ability to put 2 additional courts into that space. I think it warrants a larger discussion, because if you're going to put 2 additional courts here, you're going to be taking away grass space, and so I think you have to look at the complete picture of what it would mean to put 2 more courts there. But to me, the more pressing issue is the revamping of those current courts.
So we can compete, our varsity team can compete like many high schools in the area with 5 courts, but the condition of the 5 courts
is more of an issue.
Significant.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Maroney.
In those tennis, excuse my ignorance on tennis, but do the 5 singles players also play doubles, or do
No,
they
they
so
do
it's
not.
5 and then the other
And
2,
a new
or
set
4
of-
and 3? So
Correct.
or 6.
No, they don't
Okay.
double up. Not the varsity level.
And to that, and we've only seen 5 in the budget. No one's seen 7 in the budget, but it came up a couple times from different sources. So we have built significant athletic facilities and are proud to be able to offer conference championships and team support. Are we maxing out on space at that high school?
I mean, we're pretty tight. You've been up there on the weekends. You've seen what it's like. Between the high school use and the youth use, it's a pretty tight footprint up there.
Okay.
That's not to say we couldn't add something else down the line, but I think we use our resources well at that space.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
On the unified, Tricia Bresnahan, 11 Glenville Avenue. On the unified sports, it seemed as if last spring they piloted it at the middle school, a short amount of time, and I was just wondering if this includes doing it at the middle school, which I think would be great to give more exposure to unified sports before the kids get to high school. Thanks.
Okay. We'll move on to Personnel Human Resources, RC 18. Mrs. Sion?
Well, so most of this budget I'm going to defer to Rich, but I did want to just point out two things. First, the teacher's contract requires that there be a $50,000 fund set aside specifically for tuition reimbursement. So that's a new line in the budget, although Rich has gone back and looked at what we've historically used. And when you look at certified staff column changes, you'll see that this year we're expected to only be 17,000, and next year we're up to 76. That's based on actual requests that have already been put in by teachers who expect to complete their master's or another degree. Now, they don't all end up doing it, but those are current requests, so that explains the differential. And then for the rest, I think it's Rich.
So the other main buckets within personnel include turnover. We did budget 24 teachers going from an MA-18 to an MA-14. And then we also included 2 teachers not being replaced at the secondary level due to the workload changes in the new teacher contract. So that does total about $537,000. The year that we're currently in, staff turnover has resulted in $504,000 to date. So roughly in line with what we've seen this year. Contract support does include a number of unsettled contracts that'll go into next year, including the secretaries, the nurses, the paraprofessionals, and then not an unsettled contract, but unaffiliated as well. And then in budget control, we did include 4 positions. Those 4 positions are at a MA8. We do have 4 sections in the elementary level that are within 3 students of tipping the class size guidelines. It's 3rd grade at Hindley, 4th grade at Oxford, 2nd and 3rd grade at Tokenie.
Board questions? Mrs. McCammon?
On turnover, I'd love to see the detail that you built your assumptions on. I'm looking for a history of our actual turnover costs, as well as some what happens with the staff, overall rates of movement, and per step per students coming in and out. So I just would like to see kind of how you built your model.
So unfortunately, there isn't a lot of historical data available for turnover. We can see what was budgeted and whether or not that account was cleared out. So within the chart of accounts, it's essentially a credit on your chart of accounts. Right. And then typically in the beginning of the year, you offset that credit by the savings in the different salary accounts throughout the RCs. There's no real data available. So one of the things I looked at this year was how many teachers did we have turnover, what was the dollar amount that we looked at, and how could we get to a roughly similar position given the new teacher contract with the new steps of grades.
Because I think when we talked about it before, and correct me if I'm wrong, part of the problem was you'd have to look at everyone who resigned, the step they resigned at, right? I mean, it was a significant amount. So maybe if you can just kind of grid out how you did it for us, and we can use that moving forward. I think to go 5 years, you have to go 5 years back on each individual resignation and the step that came out. I mean, I think.
Right, but at some point, I assume that work would happen because you'd want to be building a model to predict turnover. Mm-hmm. So whether that happens for 3 days from now is one thing, but I'm assuming that's the kind of model you build. So
based on not necessarily historical.
Not necessarily. You just go year over year for the model.
I did it for year over year because there was no data.
Because you don't have the data. Yeah. But going forward, will you build a?
We can build things going forward.
Yeah. And why is there no data?
He's the new guy.
I can actually just answer some of that because we just went through this with teacher negotiations. So Munis erases the previous data. So we would have to somehow go into the individual personnel files and try to look at who left and where. But what Rich and I did this year, and I think we can do it better next year, is we keep a Google Doc of I give him who resigned. Mm-hmm. He plugs in who is hired. Sometimes when we're moving pieces of people around, it gets a little confusing, and I think that's what happened when we were trying to do it last year, so we can get better and give you that data going forward.
Okay.
So for Munis, it's so the employee job salary, which is the record that feeds payroll, is overridden every year with their new step and grade. The only way you can get historical information within Munis for that is either to run an accumulators report by individual, you can't run them by groups, or a detailed check history. So if you have, let's say, 500 teachers, you'd have to run 500 individual detailed check histories.
Yeah, I think Mike talked about the laboriousness of this before. Mrs. Stein?
Can you just give a little more detail on contract support? Is that placeholder number the cost to the legal costs associated with settling those, or is it the payment of those settlements? It's a huge number, so could you give us a little more detail on how you came at that?
It's a placement for wages for a pending settlement for 3 different bargaining units, the secretaries, the nurses, and the paraprofessionals.
So that's the potential increase to their salaries.
Right, so if you were to look at the different RCs, you'll notice like the paras are relatively zeroed out, the secretaries are zeroed out, that's because they don't have a contract. Assuming once that contract is completed and approved on, we would have to make a transfer out of that account to the various line items within the budget.
What's the average percentage you put in there for those contract settlements?
We would want to discuss that openly at this point, Mr. Deneen. However, I think the town does this the same way, right? They go and they reserve the money as the potential liability to have the money available.
I don't know.
Mr. Brown.
Oh, no, y'all wait.
Just as a follow-up to the question, we didn't have some of the backwards data, but as we had the shift in the step levels from 18 to 14, just trying to look out over the next few years, like how many people are in graduate steps over the next, or like do we have a large mass? Is there sort of a scale that's going to increase in the next few years, or just how that's going to map out? And it's kind of highlighted because we've had some reductions, say, secretarial staff, but then that labor's been replaced by higher paid people. Department heads who are now picking up the work that was previously done by admin, so you kind of have more expensive people doing the same job. I just don't know how this is going to project in terms of teachers and step levels, if we're going to have people moving into higher brackets and higher comp, and how that's going to be projected. I know we don't have the going back, but would like to know how that works out going forward.
Mrs. Stein.
Can you talk about the staff development, the driver, you said is Munis, it's almost $10,000 increase. What's going on with Munis? Is that?
So there's a need for increased capacity of Munis skills within the business office and some other areas. So it is training for staff members to attend these conferences and learn different modules. Every year, Munis has to upgrade the version that you're in. Typically, if you don't upgrade the version, you can't actually issue tax documents like W-2, so you're required to upgrade. So there is a need to constantly refresh training for a number of users.
Will this be annual, you think? I mean, is
Most
this?
districts it is.
Okay.
Mrs. McKenna.
So just to wrap up I have 2 things. First, just to wrap up the turnover conversation, I'd like to at least see the historical turnover number where we ended up the year for at least 5 years. And then on budget control, similarly, I think we have, the philosophy typically for budget control has been to manage for possible spikes in enrollment, but we've actually used that account for different purposes. So I'm assuming, based on the narrative, the philosophy is still contingency planning for enrollment spikes. But is there additional contingency planning in it, and can we see what we have accumulated so far for the historical use of that account?
So for this fiscal year, we have not used budget control. It remains untouched. All that's in the budget for next year is the equivalent of 4 teachers. No other funding for any other item is included in the budget.
I think we traditionally use it for staff for students, so in some cases we have allowed paraprofessionals to come out of there, but we don't use it for like sports uniforms. Right, we don't use it, we use it for staffing for student needs as a historical model.
Right, so so that's why I'd like to see the actual, because I like to understand. We've used it, I think, for paras, for special ed teachers, for general ed teachers. I'm just curious to see kind of how it gets used over time.
So there are no actuals that get posted to budget control.
Right, they get transferred.
I'm assuming in the past, if budget control was used, whether it be for a teacher or a paraprofessional, at some point a transfer and adjustment is made out of RC 18 to whatever RC it would be where that staffing request would be needed, so it would be difficult to determine how much was spent.
Yeah, so at least over the last 4 years, you would have approved the transfer out.
Right. I'd like us, for the purpose of budgetary conversations, I think we talked about this last year too, I'd like us to be looking at the use of this account right here at this time, beyond just the approval of the transfers, because really, that is a conversation here, but just to make sure that we all understand and are looking at that account specifically, so that we know what kind of contingency planning we need to be doing.
Are you just getting the transfer data for the last 4 years? Wouldn't that
Yeah,
show you.
that should be
Yes.
able to give it to you.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't we have a chart last year where, didn't Mike go through budget control and show us what we had
Yeah.
allocated and
Yeah.
what we had used?
So it would only be what happened from this year, and we haven't used
We
any
haven't
this
used
year.
it at all
Yeah.
this year, and I don't think.
But Rich, in its simplest form, if you need another section of Tokenique and the teacher's 80,000 a year, over the course of the year, you transfer those dollars out of budget control.
Correct.
To
With
cover
board
the cost of
approval.
that FTE.
Yeah, so the admin can't
That's
touch
creative.
budget control.
That's creative. That's good.
Talking in
I like-
high level, so.
Well, but so it also goes to, just to be clear, now that we're talking about budget control, and we had some questions later about teachers, we set sections in July, and that's what's hard when we have influxes of students come in mid-year, because we don't open up a new class in December. So you usually see real budget control section changes once school starts. Besides that, you see things like a special education teacher's needed, a paraprofessional's been needed due to an IEP contractual cost that's not covered. So that's where I think the best way to pull it from would be transfers, and it would only be transfers from the new sheet, from the sheet from last year. So I'm sure that budget document is up. We can put something together.
Oh, Dennis.
Oh, Dennis. Poor Dennis.
Question on budget control, because in here you have, say, 4 classes, Henley 3rd, Oxbridge 4th, and so on. And my question is, why isn't it 5? Because Henley first grade is at 66 students, which at class of 22, we're at the max already there. So to me, we should have 5.
We could, yeah, we really just looked at the ones that were close, but not the ones that were on target. So you could say that we need 5.
So we also try to be really conservative with budget control, because sometimes we get a hard time for budget
Right,
control.
but Henley's already at the max. The other ones are 1 or 2 away. Henley is one more tips you to another section, where the others are 1 or 2 or 3 to get to another section. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure why that one was omitted.
I think budget control can be for anyone. It might just be the description and what's been written.
Fair.
But budget control is for any school anywhere.
I think sort of the spirit of the question I'm asking, maybe the spirit of what Dennis is asking, is it would be nice if we sort of set up, whether it's, I don't know that it's a policy, but some real practice around how that number is used. It's used for if we're looking at classes, our threshold for that is 2 or 1, or, and it could be used for special education, general education. I just think it would be nice for us to have that very clearly articulated and then managed over time. Perhaps it's not so important to have information this year, but it's a contingency account. I think we should just be very explicit about it and how we use it.
Yeah, and I think
It's an
maybe
important
to your
one.
point, it's not simply a contingency account. We don't use it for textbooks.
Right.
Right. it's really a personnel contingency account.
And I thought we had agreed to rename this last year from budget control to personnel override or something like that, but just a
No, I don't have any.
requested, but not
Yeah.
voted on.
No.
Okay.
No. You may have, though. All right, are there any other questions on RC 18? Seeing none, any public comment on RC 18?
Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street. I want to make a comment on this whole discussion on budget control. I sort of look at this as the Board of Finance contingency, which is the exact same amount of $400,000 that they have in the town side for a $25 million budget, where you have $400,000, where you have a $100 million budget. And part of what budget control is, from at least an F&B perspective, is not just the teachers, but we are going to give you an appropriation for something that you're not doing for another 6 to 18 months. And during that time, things will come up that was not anticipated. And so that's what your budget control is. You want to call it flexibility, that's what it really is. It could be flexibility that you're doing a teacher, an aide, or something else that might come up, security, that you may want to implement. So don't be so quick, because that same number sits in the Board of Selectmen budget for a much smaller total budget. Number 2, on the turnover, I'm a little bit hesitant to look at what the historic is, because remember, we've had a tremendous turnover in our teachers over the last couple of years, and part of it was the new administration, part of it was the implementation of department chairs, and part of it was, pardon me for putting it quite bluntly, cleaning up our staff. So assuming that we are now there, the reasons why people may have left before may not be the reasons why people are leaving now. Lastly, I'm very happy to see the new numbers in there for the contracts. But again, this is a nuance that the town has been doing for years, and it's worthwhile to have a conversation with the Board of Finance on what you do with the balance of this. On the town side, because they can carry reserves, which the Board of Ed cannot, there is a balance sheet item that the monies that they do not spend from one contract year ends up on the balance sheet side to be used in future years. So again, if you're putting in $90,000 this year, but you're only going to use $70,000, that potentially is $20,000 going into an existing town balance sheet account. Same thing on the $300,000. So there's things that, with the new accounting, I would encourage the administration to talk to the Board of Finance on what you do with the remaining balance, so it's consistent with what the town does with the exact same account. Thank you.
Any other public comment on personnel? Seeing none, thank you, Mrs. Stein and Mr. Rudall, and we will move forward to the administration RC 16. Dr. Adley, are you taking this one?
I am, yes. This is essentially my office. Includes myself and two very important people. The one who sits at the front door here to let people in, and the one who lets people pass into my office, and the dean. So you will see that. You'll see that there was a one-time adjustment that goes away next year. That was part of the contract. And the major things here, the significant things, are really the consultant services, which reflects that a reduction for the strategic plan that we're paying this year, and then we actually put in place, because when we do the demography report and the enrollment report, I really don't have a place for it, so it's in here. And I don't know if we adjusted the line item somewhere else for it, but we put it in here as an annual expense. That's your main thing. The legal fees are a figment of increase in rates, which we talked a little bit earlier. But, dues and fees, essentially, given I was hired, that wasn't accounted for in terms of contractually some of those dues and fees for the professional organisations and otherwise. There is potentially one other one, but that would be a discussion with the board at the appropriate time.
Questions on administration? Let's start with consultant services. The demography report. Malone and McBroom just did a report. Besides that, we typically do it in-house. Are we saying we're going out again next year?
Well, we do certainly have a placeholder for it to go out again next year. I guess it's a discussion I would like with the board anyway as to the most volatile numbers that we have are primarily at kindergarten. And that's what changes things. And I don't have a crystal ball about kindergarten. So typically, it's not untypical of districts, and particularly in our surrounding towns, to actually go out every year. Pardon? They all do. Oh, they all do. Okay, all right.
Because we typically did that in-house.
Yeah, we typically been pretty accurate in-house.
For kindergarten?
Well, Dr. De Silva has that crystal ball, so unless you're taking it with you.
I'd like to see it.
Well, I guess what I'd like to understand, I mean, Malone and McBroom, we usually go out every couple of years, but what you saying that best practice or surrounding practice is to go out every year to an outside consultant?
Well, it could be you've got a range of things to just get it done every year as a matter of practice, or alternatively, you could certainly get the kindergarten. I have an experience of doing the same thing with the crystal ball. You do it every couple of years, you massage it, it works out fairly well in all experience. What doesn't work out well typically is the kindergarten, right? So, although in some cases, demographers' reports aren't exactly accurate either, so I would perhaps, a compromise could be to have it done for the early age level, but it's a discussion for the board. But since it isn't budgeted anywhere else, I put it in here.
Okay, so the $10,000 includes a full enrollment report And if we were to just adjust it to a K only, that would be a reduced amount?
Well, we would reduce the cost of the report. I don't know by how much, but it would.
Okay. Mr. Burke?
On our legal services, our year-to-date, $52,219. Does that include the legal fees that were generated during the teacher negotiation process, or is that bill still?
I don't think
It's still outstanding.
It's still outstanding.
Can I just go back to demographics really quickly?
Yep.
Over the next 3 years, we have 3 major projects going online. So it might make sense to do a more comprehensive report over that time period, or, you know, because you're gonna have new people moving in and study the trends, or maybe a year, 2 years from now. So
Yeah.
maybe skip a year. Just keep that in mind when you.
Legal. We cut legal pretty significantly last year. How's that working out?
We'll find out when we get the negotiation invoices.
Good luck. And so this is just a planned increase based on what you
So,
expect to be increased?
We did get rates from Shipman and Goodwin for effective next year, and depending on the individual, it goes anywhere from 6% to 14%.
Okay.
For an hourly rate increase.
Yeah, Ms. McCammon.
When we set the legal services budget, do we look at ebbs and flows from things like contractual increases or contractual negotiations? Should we be doing that? Like I would expect in years where we negotiate a lot of contracts.
Yes, I
Yeah,
think
the-
last year that was part of the conversation we cut. Mr. Feeney signaled that we had, I was looking to slash and burn a little bit more. Mr. Feeney said you will have teacher negotiations. So at least that last year, that was part of the conversation. Dues and memberships are up significantly.
Well, that's, and honestly, that's part of my contract that wasn't accounted for, and it has to be accounted for retrospectively a little bit. There is one other membership there that would be up for discussion at the district management group, and that would be a discussion. Oh, sorry, the Connecticut Center for School Change is not part of the contract. I think you know the board is engaged actually with the Connecticut Center for School Change, but that would be a discussion that would be in all honesty, it'll be a negotiation in terms of whether you would want me to be part of that organization or not.
Is that included in the 10,000?
Yes, that's included in this.
It is included.
Okay, so to better understand that, can we just get a breakdown of what that cost would be? Any other questions for administration? Any public comment on administration? All right. We are down to RC20, our last of the day. We've never done a budget day this quickly. Go us. Finance. This means our other nights are going to be long, guys. Finance. Mr. Rudel, you're back up.
Sure. So there's a few changes within the RC20 finance. The first is we are recommending reclassification of some certain personnel. It is FTE and budget neutral. The current person who's in the principal director secretary line item, we are recommending being coded to the transportation coordinator line item. It is more reflective of the actual work that she does. Districts this size typically do have a transportation coordinator. We are recommending a sharing of an administrative assistant between finance and facilities. It is a model that is typical in our DIRG. It is in Ridgefield, it's in New Canaan, it's in Weston. It creates a little bit better synergies between finance and operations and facilities. One of the other items that we added here include consulting services. So we have talked about at a number of finance committee meetings the need to implement the Uniform Chart of Accounts, or UCOA. This would be a one-time expenditure to contract with Bloom Shapiro, who is the state provider for implementing the Uniform Chart of Accounts. That would allow us, if we wanted to improve transparency or maybe make tweaks to our finance reports or even our budget long-term. Typically, you would want to have your financial reports mirror your broad categories that are within your policy. We are required when submitting the EFS report, which was the previous EDO1, to submit based on UCOA. So it would be recommended to implement the Uniform Chart of Accounts.
Any board questions on the finance department? Mrs. McCammon?
2 questions. The first is the Munis training that was 2 RCs ago. Should it be in this account since it's?
We could, so they have had Munis training here in the past, and it was coded to RC 18.
Yeah.
So that's why we budgeted in RC 18. You could make a case that it should go in finance because it's primarily the finance users who would use it.
Although we are,
The account in my RC is for all non-certified staff training. I think that's what it covers, so that's why it's there, I think.
Mr. Janine?
So Rich, does the ACOA going to that, does that help if we start to look at the opengov.com and that financial reporting? Is there anything correlated to that? Or?
So it's primarily how you use Munis, how you issue financial reports, and how you issue your budget documents. If there's a desire to have a little bit more transparency and clarity within your budget documents, going to UCOA would help. For example, one of the items that was brought up earlier was the cost of diesel fuel within transportation. Typically, UCOA would have a transportation line item and then a fuel cost line item. You can see those segregated. It doesn't necessarily change your RCs. Those are your cost centers, and you can have as many or as little RCs as you want. But what the chart of accounts does is it maps out your financial data, and the clearer your financial chart of accounts is, the clearer your data is going to be able to present.
Thank you.
Mrs. Stein?
So looking at staffing, we're adding 0.83. We're still significantly below our DIRG in terms of staffing for a budget of our size. Can you speak to your confidence in the number of staff you will have?
So we are the lowest FTE in the DIRG with the second highest budget. I did propose, though it didn't make in the budget, in addition.
Saw that, Luke. That's okay.
Sorry. Sorry. Well, I mean, if we're going to throw it on the table, throw it on the table.
In addition of an accountant, typically a business office within a school district would have a director of finance and operations, an assistant director of finance. So if you were to look at the chart of accounts and you would split them in half between your payroll items and then your non-payroll items, that assistant director of finance is typically looking at and working on your non-payroll items. They're looking at purchase orders, they're looking at trend analysis, they're doing those types of things. Because of the small nature of our department, that position's really also acting here as a payroll supervisor. Districts our size typically have more than a 0.5 payroll person. So we do have one individual who's 0.5 who does payroll every 2 weeks, which is also one of the reasons why we have an assistant director of finance who has to kind of jump into that work. We do have obviously a lot of benefit information because we have a number of employees, but we also have work that has to do on the town pension. So if employees are considering retiring or they're looking for a valuation on what they might receive, that's also a burden on the district. A number of districts also have just a separate benefits person. So if you were to look at New Canaan, for example, or Westport or Ridgefield, they basically split payroll between payroll and benefits, so one on each individual side. One of the things I think the district would benefit from is more oversight centrally for student activity accounts. We do have a very good student activity manual here. I think we could do more to implement it.
It's a great manual.
It is. We have a very good system in School Cash Online. I think we could benefit specifically from K-5 being centralized so that we could use that tool a little bit more effectively. And then having a little bit more oversight within central office on those student activity accounts. I think that would be a benefit to the district. We do have a district.
Sorry, some of us are falling in love.
Yes, you're music to our ears.
The district, this is a district with a large amount of accounts receivable. Most districts don't actually have a large amount of accounts receivable. Darien Summer School is $600,000. It's a large accounts receivable workflow. ELP is over $300,000. That's a large accounts receivable. Field rentals, building fees. Those are all large accounts receivable. And one of the things I know Mike has talked about before my time was the collection of fees primarily for fields. Having someone who can, dedicate themselves to accounts receivable, and one of the benefits of sharing the director of facilities secretary with finance is that person who's already doing accounts receivable for fields and building fees could also pick up that work for ELP, could pick up that work for Darien Summer School, and you're kind of centralizing accounts receivable. I think that would have a benefit. Kind of a long-winded answer, but typically you would want to have somebody who's a director of finance, an assistant director of finance, an accountant who's gonna do student activities, things like that, maybe non-payroll items, a payroll benefits person. And I do think this district would benefit from having a transportation coordinator. It is a large portion of our budget. It's something that occurs every day. There's not a day that goes by where we don't get a call about transportation. Most districts this size do have a transportation coordinator. It doesn't mean they won't do any other work, because there are ebbs and flows within that type of position. I mean, it's obviously very busy in the beginning of the school year as everybody's getting their bus assignments. But having that person dedicated there, and then it would also help alleviate some of the burden on special ed who's down a secretary. Typically, a transportation coordinator would also coordinate, let's say, out-of-district transportation runs, so calling a Relio or an ECS to secure those services for students. And then it would also create those better synergies between special ed and finance.
So that's what would happen.
Right.
So can you explain the model you're proposing and how you see it working?
Sure. So it is, like, again, I mentioned I did ask for an accountant, so it is not the ideal model, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you for
So,
the
You said no?
Thank you
Can
for
I
the clarification.
can I just say, is that going to be a deferral and something you think we'll see next year? And can we add that to our sheet?
I don't anticipate seeing that next year.
Okay.
Let's hear about this
But
model.
let's hear about the model first.
Okay.
Because this is the model before us.
Sure. So I would like to see the split facilities director, secretary, and then finance director, secretary take on a role within accounts receivable. I would like to see more of the benefit administration handled by our payroll person, and I want our payroll person to take a more active role in doing things like history transfers. So a lot of times payroll is processed, it might go to a wrong account, so you can, in Munis, you can do a history transfer to ensure it's in the right account. Right now, that workflow is falling on the assistant director of finance. I'd like to free that work up and allow her to kind of focus on that other section of the chart of accounts. And then by taking off some of the accounts receivable and putting it on that facility director's administrative assistant, it would free that person up to do work on student activity accounts, really kind of implementing school cash online at the K-5 level, doing a little bit more account analysis, and then really working in tandem with the assistant director of finance to kind of bridge that hole that we have right now.
And if that's a job description, do you, do the skill sets match up enough such that you can hire someone who's good at both?
We wouldn't be hiring anybody under
No,
this
no, but
model.
even if you're doing, I was trying to keep it non-personal, so not any particular employee, but if you're taking a facilities secretary and now you're asking her to also handle some of the financial, you're comfortable that people have the skill set to
So
handle the
specifically in that one role, yes, because she's already doing accounts receivable.
I picked her because I know that.
Right. So particularly in that role, yes. I do think the department could always learn more and have increased capacity. I think that's where Munis training would help. Like I said, it's not the ideal model, but I think it is a step in the right direction for the department.
Okay.
So part of the parameter here was, we're not going to design a model that's not going to work, right? So we're not going to put it on a table regardless of expense or otherwise, it's not going to work, so that's.
So it'll work.
It'll work. We'll see if it works.
It'll work.
We believe it'll work.
It will work. That's why it's in the budget. Mrs. McCammon.
I just want to flag it, although it's not at cut night, that I'd love for it to see a line item for OpenGov, because this is the budget for the following year, so.
So I think we keep, this OpenGov keeps coming up. In fact, the newspaper called me about it because they felt like it was a story. And
They wrote an article.
I missed the article then, so they did write an
It
article.
was a
Was I
story.
quoted in there?
It was a story.
Because I talked to them. All right, good, I missed that article. So I feel, what I feel like has now happened in 3 separate conversations is that we had heard the administration, even when it came up in goals and objectives, say, look, we hear you want to be more transparent, let us go through a year and tell you how to be more transparent. And OpenGov is one avenue which might do that, but we'd like to look at how to do that. And I think the board's goal is to be more transparent. And I think, Mr. Riddle, you also said you've never seen a school district that actually uses OpenGov. So rather than hem us into any one particular software program, I think what we're asking the administration is, can you come forward after going through this cycle with the best way to show information so the public can understand it, have access, ask questions. I am just, as much as I hear it, and Mr. Zagrodzky and I joke back and forth about it all the time, I don't want to hem us into one software program. That's what I've also heard from the administration, that they're not prepared to hem us into one software program. So if what we want to do is put in a study for the best way to display information, I'd be supportive of that. I'm just reticent to like pick one program. Mr. Sini.
You're missing a big piece of this, though, and that program, the program that is been requested is OpenGov by our Board of Finance. So I'm not sure if we have to fund that, but we have specifically been asked to implement a specific software so that we merge with the rest of the town for transparency. I'm sure there's better Board of Ed software to give transparency, but not in an integrated way with the rest of the town budget. I think that's the big missing piece.
No, I'm aware of the request. I'm also aware where I think the board has now said 3 times they are on it. So to Mr. McCammon, of having one line like OpenGov, I'm aware that's what the Board of Finance is requesting.
So
I'm just
maybe
not
they
sure the
fund it.
Board of Ed has requested that yet.
I think in good faith, particularly Richard and I in this capacity, and a team actually, are going to look at that, right? And if it makes sense and it's not a huge amount of other things that add other things to it or other ways, then I'd argue, like, why wouldn't we? But I mean, it's not, we haven't done it yet, I mean, in all honesty, but I'm open to it, and we'll give it a good look and try to comply. If it's easy to comply, fine, we'll do that. But I don't know about putting something in. I wouldn't have to know what to put in here at the minute. I haven't looked at it or I haven't investigated. But that's not an indication that I'm not going to do what the board asks just to do.
This would be a perfect line item to go right to the Board of Finance for also if we had to add to it. I mean, if we had to add to our budget.
Yeah, or but we may have to maintain it unless they want to maintain it year over year. I mean, it's like if F&B came to us and said, I'd like you to put all your things in Excel instead of Munis. Like, it's a valid request. The board just has to decide where they are in it based on administrative recommendation. Mr. Brown.
I just know with all this Munis training, if this was something that was touched on, was interoperability with other systems, OpenGov in particular would be a nice one to learn about, if that's something they discuss.
So
You want to talk about Munis?
my understanding is OpenGov just kind of sits on top of Munis to provide reports. The idea for more training within Munis really is to learn new modules, learn how to process payroll, be a little bit more automated. One of the things we're working on this year is to actually automate the accrual tables. So we have to, at the end of the year when our audit's going on, we have to talk about and report out on what our accrued liabilities are in terms of compensation for employees who might leave, who have that in their contract. There's ways in Munis to automate that. If you have small staff, leveraging that technology to automate more would be beneficial for everybody. But there's a learning curve for people to do that, and the only way they're going to get that is professional development, no different than a teacher who might have professional development within Susie's budget.
So actually, and I wasn't not sure I was in favor of the whole Munis thing, but part of what you're saying is the $10,000 PD might actually help with an actual FTE at some point. If you got more people who could automate more
Potential.
work.
I mean, one of the things you want to do is improve the capacity of the individuals within your department. It would be great to finish up the accrual tables. It would be great to put in life insurance tables so that's more automated. There's a lot of things Munis can do. It's a very robust tool. It has a lot of features to it. It's not always the most user-friendly, and so that kind of deters some people. But it has a lot of capabilities. It's just a matter of using those capabilities.
Mr. Burke.
Just on OpenGov, I would be interested to see an assessment if that's something that would be appropriate, for us. I'm not tied to a particular program or a name. Just what's the most transparent and what's would work best for us, a school system, and I would look to be guided by the administration of the building about that topic.
Mrs. McCammon.
I think the request is for something that's most transparent across town bodies. So I think that's, there might be a program that's optimal for a specific school system, but I think we're looking to solve kind of for town, and that's the request. So to that end, I think that I agree with you, the board hasn't had a full discussion, but really this budget is effectively the roadmap. So I'm just flagging now, we're not making the decision right now, but I'm flagging now that I'll be asking for a line item for OpenGov. In the paper, at least, they indicated that the budgetary module is $20,000, and what they call the transparency module, which I assume is just an internet user interface, is $19,000. There's probably some sort of implementation cost, which you know, I presume we could ballpark something. So I'm just flagging that's where I'm going.
Mr. Maroney?
Yeah, to circle back to something Katie was asking for is, you know, I think, you know, Rich made a really great pitch on why he needs an accountant, and I look back through Dr. Adley's presentation, and there's a lot of things in here which was not included, such as the ELL teacher accountant, K-1 displays, so on and so forth. For me, along with the deferrals, I'd also like to see what is the top priority of the things you didn't include. Because I don't know if we asked for that, but to me, I'd really like to make sure we have that as well. And if something is a high priority, but we're not ready to implement it, or you just felt it wasn't budgetarily ready at this time. But
So I'll pick up on that as a general comment. I think that, and maybe psychologists were part of the impetus for this, like the board was surprised that there had been a request it hadn't heard for a number of years. And I do think there's something to hear about, like, hey, this is on the horizon. I'm mindful of we're about to enter into the strategic plan process, and that's really going to dictate where we go. And so I think this budget needs to service our kids for the next year. It needs to be thoughtful. It doesn't drive too much, but we also need mindful that we are about to enter a process that really is going to set a roadmap for a number of years. And so that's the only yin and yang. I think we're all really eager for it, and I don't want to jump out ahead of it without having done the work, but I absolutely hear you saying, especially because today we've heard, well, it's not in here, but I want it. And that's really the first time we've had those types of conversations. I'm just grappling with the best way to put that in context and get an appropriation. So kids first, always, and efficiently running a district, and I think we're all really excited for the strategic plan. Any other questions on finance?
Do we have an opportunity to ask like broader, just high-level budget questions, or should I ask
Sure,
it now?
you can ask it now.
So the chart you gave us the other night, chart 5, was great. That was kind of budget versus what was returned back to the town. And I guess I would start off by saying to the other two movies here, we realize that this is not your budget per se. I mean, you're carrying on. I realize you're implementing it, but you haven't had a full year to kind of go through everything. I just really appreciate the work you guys have done. So what I did was I analyzed the last 3 years, and the overage, I should say, the ended year returns to the town have been kind of building on average. I mean, there's a couple outlier years. And I also realize this is amongst, I believe this chart is over 8 years amongst 4 different superintendents, not including yourself. You know, one of the things I want to be cognizant of is this town has been very good in this district, very good about finding efficiencies intra-year, and also finding other projects to use some of those efficiencies and then return back. So as you get to, I guess the question is, you know, given the last 3 years we've had an average of $500,000 returned, you know, is there possibly some line items in this budget that we've gone back to year after year after year? And I think some people in town have been, you know, doing some analysis around the transfers that maybe we have been budgeting a little too high amongst these line items, and they've been acting as a source of intra-year transfers. And I realize that we're not going to get an answer today, but as a new administration coming in and analyzing these numbers, if you can be cognizant of the sources of intra-year capital transfers, and maybe take a little closer look, because I feel like we have a great Board of Finance that if we do short our budget in some way, shape, or form, or we come in over budget is a different way to put it, that we can easily go back and have the justification to get the funding, instead of maybe over budgeting an average of $500,000 a year. And I realize on a percentage basis, it's a pretty small number, but it's also given the opportunity for some transfers over the years that people, you know, have caused a flutter, to put it mildly. So that's my request.
Yeah, sure. I can say that certainly the longer we're here, the more we know, and the more you know, right? But I can tell you that having gone through every single line item with personnel, so on and so forth, I can tell you I haven't budgeted, and perhaps with living through it, I'll say, oh, okay, well, that there was more room there than anticipated. But I can look at you now and tell you that I'm not budgeting anything, particularly when I'm letting people go. I am not budgeting anything here that I don't think is, like, there's no fluff here and here, right? There's no extra account. The only thing you've got is the overage that we budget in for teachers, right? But I don't believe in budgeting like a 2% this or a thing, a buffer, and that's not in here to the best of my knowledge, right?
Right. I mean, that's
certainly not consciously.
Yeah. I mean, that's my point. Just if you could look harder at those areas that the transfers have come out of, just to ensure
that's a fair
to learn something you might not know.
Yeah, thanks.
Mr. Burke.
Just following up on that, just so I'm clear on your process, when you look at a line, and let's say it's $270,000 last year, you're proposing it be $270,000 this year, you're doing more than saying, oh, well, okay, I'm not going to increase that. You're also looking to see, all right, it was 270 last year. Could it be 240 going? So, you know, you're looking behind those numbers for those efficiencies, correct?
Yes, and actually line by line, and that's why I actually appreciate giving the staff the opportunity to share what perhaps they would have liked to have seen in and not liked to have seen in, because I think about that process, and particularly when you're asking for things that, so yes, all of those lines are scrutinized.
Mr. Brown.
Just to clarify on that, I mean, to Mr. Burke's example, I would think we go in every year and say the 270 previous, why can't it be zero this year if we're doing zero-based budgeting?
So those line items do get zeroed out. Really what we're doing when we look at the previous years, we're drilling down on the general ledger and looking at every record that was made in that account. So if it accumulated to 270, it could have been 20 or 30 records that added up to that 270. Or some of those one-time items where you'd have to pull them back. A good example is like special education tuition. If a student aged out, just because we spent 270 last year doesn't necessarily mean you're going to spend 270 this year.
I think also, and actually it's a point Mr. Davis brought up earlier, we are making a budget 18 months out, and the reason why the state asks for an itemized estimate is it realizes the need, and if a student is in need, we do need some flexibility, and that's why our transfers and our emergency transfers policies are there, because you can't tell the student, well, could you please wait while we go? So I think it's always good to go back and look. I love that last year we came within 0.3% of our budget. I'm not really sure you can do more than that. We've also had some generous state, I shouldn't say generous because it's not 100%, but we have had some excess cost numbers that have made our numbers kind of fluctuate, but we can always do better. But I do think that, you know, 0.3s, 0.5s on a $100 million budget is really good. And so continue to look, but job well done so far. Any other broader questions before I call for public comment on finance? Public comment on finance.
Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street. Be careful what you ask for. I understand that Mr. Cini is saying, well, you know, the Board of Finance is requesting that you go to OpenGov, and they might pay for it, but the Board of Finance really doesn't have a budget. It ends up in the Board of Selectmen budget, and I don't think you want to hear the Board of Selectmen telling the Board of Ed that they're paying for your OpenGov thing. I mean, you might, but not something I would necessarily encourage. Number two, I'm a believer in OpenGov. Governor Kasich saved millions of dollars in the state of Ohio. However, the reality is to look at the Board of Ed and the Board of Selectmen budgets, they look at them separately. And so having them be able to make pretty pictures doesn't necessarily help, because I do the same analysis every month, and I have full access to the Board of Ed's budget, and I have full access to the Board of Selectmen's budget. Now, I may have to download some things, and that's something, if you do go to another system, it would be nice that I would be able to pull and do some of my own analysis there. In looking at what, because F&B does do a take on how you ended up, sometimes it's not good to just look at that final number. The year that you ended up with a significant number out of excess cost is because a whole new category was added to what was submitted based upon the work that Heather Shea did, that significantly increased what our submissions were and what we got back. So that wasn't anticipated until it was said, oh, look, we haven't been doing this for years. So sometimes it's not the final number, but it's how you got to that final number. And for those who do know me, I am pretty fiscally conservative. And I do look at where the pockets are, not only at the Board of Ed, but also at the Board of Selectmen. And I do believe both of the organizations do need some flexibility. You just put it in different pockets, but anytime somebody wants to sit down with me, I'd be more than happy to show where the Board of Selectmen pockets are and where the Board of Ed pockets are. And you might be surprised to see what they are.
No soliciting business at the
Stacy TA, 10 Clocks Lane. Just in listening to the conversation about OpenGov today, I wasn't here when the powers that be decided that OpenGov was the thing that we were going to do. But listening to the conversation, listening to Rich's feedback, it sounds to me like the Board of Ed was not considered in that conversation, because I'm hearing that other school districts don't use it and it would cost us money to use. So I know I'm preaching to the wrong table, but it sounds like it's something that should have been discussed at OPC and doesn't sound like it was.
Any other public comment? That really was on finance, but it kind of went to anything, so I'll call for last public comment. Or any board questions before we close out today? All right, thank you all for. Oh, Paul, you're coming. I thought you were leaving, Paul. I'm happy to see you.
Great.
Happy New Year.
Just one comment.
Can you just give your name and address?
Paul Henderson, 97 White Street. Page 128, Rich did a good analysis on the people per business office. If there's some way he could break that out by position so we can compare apples to apples and make sure we're covering what other people are covering and we aren't missing anything. That's the only comment.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Any final board comment? Thank you all. We've never been out by 4. I need to entertain a motion to adjourn. Mrs. Stein and Mrs. Maroney, all in favor? Well done, everybody.